Welcome to our conversations about Saint Angela and her spirituality, as it is kind of demonstrated in the book, also in your midst. At the beginning. Anyway, this is the beginning too. We have a series of conversations about Saint Angela and her charism and her spirituality. And each week that we meet, we will have a different group. Some repeats, some, and some of them it's entirely different, new group. But these are all people who know something about Saint Angela. So we will have a conversation after I say some things, and that's how we will end our session. And I'm thanking all of you all for being here, because anybody who gives up a Monday morning in vacation time to talk this way has got to be a hero, and I'm very grateful. Or maybe I'm getting you out of something, I don't know. Anyway, maybe you could introduce yourselves and say something about yourself.
Sure. I'm Amy Olson. I'm Director of Mission Effectiveness, and I'm also an Ursuline Associate.
I'm Jenny Schaefer, and I am the Director of the Angela Merici Center for Spirituality.
And I'm Lisa Steiner, and I head up our social concerns, and I'm also an Ursuline Associate.
And I'm Martha Buser, I'm an Ursuline sister. And I'd really like to talk about St. Angela. Now, we're going to talk about Angela, women, and hospitality. Not necessarily in that order, kind of all mixed together, but we're going to kind of cover all of that. First thing I want to do is talk about Angela, who was a woman who straddled the 15th and 16th centuries, high Renaissance in Italy. She was born, we're not real sure when, so it's always kind of iffy. It's 1490 or maybe 1494, or who knows? We do know when she died, kind of in the mid-16th century. And she was born in a family with 4 children, 3 boys, 2 boys and 2 girls. There was a boy first, and then Angela's sister, whose name we don't know, and then herself, and then a little boy whose name we don't know. The only one in the family whose name we know is Angela's, and her father, who was John. They were born, she was born in a little lake town called Desenzano on the shore of Lake Garda, which is the largest lake in Italy. I always thought we were talking about, Lake Michigan or something. No way. It's rather, when I first saw it, I thought, this is the largest lake in Italy. Try to get that in your head. But it's beautiful. It's kind of like a spoon. The bowl is at the bottom, and the handle goes up into Austria. And Desenzano is right at the tip of the bowl. So there's a big stretch of Lake Garda, but you don't really see all of that because it is not a terribly wide lake. But it's very beautiful, and there's still fishermen villages, mostly, but there's still trade that goes along all the little villages along the lake. So that's the kind of town she was born in, too. We don't know where she was born exactly, though there are some thoughts that there's this building that looks kind of like an apartment building that the family apparently lived in. But Mr. Merici was not a poor man. He was a landowner, and anybody who owned land was not poor. So he was a farmer, and he moved his family from there to a little area called La Grezza. La Grezza is not a town. I don't know what you call it. It's an area out between Desenzano and the next village. And that's where they had their farm. And so Angela grew up on a farm with her brothers and sister. Because of the times, folks did not know much about hygiene and the importance of being clean. and not having rats and mice, mosquitoes. The house wouldn't be what we would say dirty, but it was open. It had a dirt floor. Oh, we know what it looks like. It's still there. That's the farmhouse. There's like a semicircle of houses, only they're all connected. So I don't know what you call that. Maybe you could call them townhouses. I don't know. Call them what you will. They were farmhouses connected. And theirs was at the end, either the first one or the last one, depending upon how you look at it. Anyway, it had a dirt floor. It still has a dirt floor. And a very large fireplace and a well, which is interesting because that means they had indoor running water. And that's really exciting, even though the floor was dirt. Upstairs, there's a room, a small room, and that was the bedroom. Everybody slept in the same bedroom, and everybody slept on the floor. That always shocks Americans when they go into that room and see a mat on the floor, and that was Angela's mat. Well, we don't know if that was Angela's mat, but they probably all slept on mats because that was pretty common. She died in a bed. Now that one we know, but she didn't live in a house where there were beds, so far as we know. Education-wise, Angela was well educated for her day. Her father used to gather his family and read to them. And he had somewhat of a library. He had the lives of the saints and the scriptures. And he read to them from those two books. Whether he had other books, we don't know. When Angela died, she had more than those two books. But we don't know if her father had that many books. But anyway, so she learned how to read from her father, and that was a whole lot. So she was not illiterate. Apparently she didn't know how to write, though, because we don't have anything in her handwriting. She had, of all things, she had a secretary. His name was Cosano, and she dictated her rule and anything else she had to say, and he was the scribe. That's an historical fact. That's not a myth. Anyway, so she lived there, and they grew up on a farm, and the children grew up on the farm, and farms were small. You might think of a city block with a sidewalk all around it. That was the farm. That's all the larger they were. And we don't know what they grew. Wheat, maybe? Whatever else. They did have a vineyard in the village. Everybody kept the vineyard together, so it was not on the farm itself. Now, they grew up in a time when there were very interesting laws, one of which was you were not to pick up the sticks around twigs and whatever. And you think, now you have to pay kids to do that. But see, that was their source of firewood. So they needed those sticks to start a fire in the fireplace. So it was against the law. I think that is so funny. And then other thing they weren't allowed to do was cut through the yard, or I think of it as a yard, but it was the farm. You couldn't go through somebody else's farm. Cut corners from sidewalk to sidewalk, so to speak. Well, apparently the Merici kids were pretty normal kids, because today, and I just can't believe they still have those records from those days. It shows these Merici kids, not Angela, but the other kids were fined, or they got in trouble with the law, and their father was fined because so-and-so ran across the yard. So-and-so picked up sticks that didn't belong to them, and somebody in the family picked grapes in somebody else's vineyard. And of course, you couldn't do that either. So, but Angela's name never appeared in the list of the naughty ones. I don't know if she was, I don't know the reason. I don't think she was a goody two-shoes. She doesn't come across like that. But anyway, that was the fact. As was common in those days, because they did not know about medicine and how to take care of yourself. There were many epidemics. We call them epidemics. Even today, we have thousands of people who die of the flu every year. So periodically an epidemic would go through an area and many people died. So in Angela's life, there was an epidemic. It was not the bubonic plague or anything like that. It was an epidemic. And both of her parents died, and her older brother and her sister. Now, they didn't all die in the same epidemic, but before she was an adult, those people had died. The death that really, really affected her was the death of her sister. She was very close to her sister, and because her sister's name appears in the records that she was kind of naughty once in a while. This always strikes me as, I don't know, amusing. Angela worried about her that maybe she wasn't in heaven. So you have to keep that in mind. Because we do talk about Angela's vision, and that comes at another time. But anyway, she worried about her sister. Then, as she was growing up and her family had all died, she and her younger brother went to live with her uncle and aunt. Their name was Biancosi. And they lived in another village along the bowl of the spoon called Selo. We always called it Selo until we found out that was a dirty word. We did not know that. So the first time we went to Selo, do you know that?
I did know that, actually.
I don't know what it means, but don't tell me. Anyway, the first day we went there, and there were Carmelite fathers who ran a retreat center, and we told them we wanted to go to Selo, and they all kind of backed away and smiled behind their head. But you don't want to say it that way. It's Selo. Anyway, so that's where they lived, and her uncle and aunt Biancosi were wealthy people, and it was a different strata of society. So Angela learned to do all the things that ladies learn to do, like sew and cook and not tend house, but oversaw the housework. It was an entirely different milieu for her. Then besides that, one of the greatest things that happened to her in her lifetime was that she met the Franciscans. Right across the lake, or out into the lake from Selo, is a little island, and there was a Franciscan friary there. And so she met the friars there and became a third order member. And that was very important for a couple of reasons. Number one, Franciscans are missionaries. And somehow that contact with them broadened her view, her understanding of the world. And that is very important for us today. Because while she came from a little backwater town to start with, that was not her mentality, because she had been exposed to the whole missionary world. The missionary world at that time was really growing. This was the time of the Jesuits and Francis Xavier and all those folks who went as far as Japan and other lands, so they were somehow that was in the air, that kind of adventure. So that was important for her, but Franciscans also fostered in her the gifts of simplicity, joy, and hope. Those are so important to remember. Simplicity of life, joy, and hope. She was always a woman of joy. Okay, so that's Angela. Now, she had a lot of friends, which says a lot of things about her, too. But obviously, if you have a lot of friends, either you have a lot of money and you're attracting people that way, or you are a happy person and a joyful person with a joy that attracts. So she had a lot of friends, not just in her own family and neighborhood, but when the Franciscans sent her to Brescia, which was a much larger town, she attracted a lot of people there too. At first I thought these were all old men that she became friends with, that they kind of, adopted her, took care of her. not so, they were all young men. By the time she went to Brescia, she was in her 40s. These fellows were in their 20s, just starting families. I always think that's interesting, whether she was then like a mother figure to them. But anyway, so she met all these people. There was an organization called the Divine Amore, Holy Love, the Divine Love. It was an organization of men. The hierarchical church was absent in their day. There were priests, but bishops were pretty scarce. Occasionally, a bishop would come in, collect the dues from the parishes, and you'd never see him again. So there were not many members of the super hierarchy around, but there were a lot of priests, especially Franciscans, were around. So, but they asked her to go from Silo to Brescia. It's about 50 miles, I guess. You can get there on the bus. And when she got there, her task was to bring comfort to widows. There was a war going on. There were always wars going on. Italy was not a nation, but there were city-states like Milan and Venice, Florence, a number of the large cities were like, I guess you could call them provinces, I don't know. They were always fighting with each other. So there was always a war going on. Then there was the French who were invading Italy, and so there was always, international wars, and the French disease, which was another name for syphilis. They didn't know what to call it, but because it kind of followed the camps, they called it the French disease. I don't know what the French called it. They probably called it the Italian or the Venetian disease or whatever. But anyway, so there were a lot of widows and there were a lot of poor people. And Angela was open to being with them. The Franciscans did not tell her to do any of that. They just kind of put her there, told her to go there, and she did all the things that she could. Some people want to call her a nurse. You can call her a nurse if you want to. Some people call her a teacher. Well, you can call her that if you want to. She surely talked to the kids. But whatever she did, she brought comfort. And then she got to know women better, because besides the men who belonged to the Divino Amore, they built hospitals and things like that. Besides them, they had wives and daughters, and so she got to know them. She had some wonderful friends whose names just trips off the tongue. They're so beautiful. One of her best friends was by that time she was a Franciscan Third Order member. She met a woman who was a Dominican Third Order, and her name was Osanna Andreazzi. Now, isn't that beautiful? It's music to the ear. Osanna Andreazzi. Now, she died, and Angela went to her, shrine, because if you don't know this about Italians, they have a great devotion to the dead and to the bodies of the dead. So there were a lot of shrines to people who were considered holy people. And Osanna was a holy lady. So there was a shrine there. So Angela went there on pilgrimage. She was one of her friends, one of her closest friends. There was a lady named Ippolita. I like that name too, Ippolita. And her last name would have been Gallo because her brother was a good friend of Angela's, Agostino Gallo. But Ippolita became one of Angela's close friends. And there was a woman named Elizabeth Prato, or Prato is probably the proper pronunciation, but she was her best friend, Elizabeth, who never joined the group. But they were very good friends. They were fast friends, and because Elizabeth was a very wealthy widow, she knew that Angela was gathering people around her, women, and so she I don't know if she had it built, but she lived in a beautiful home on the square. The square is still there, but during the Second World War, a lot of that was demolished. So the building that this room was in, we always called it a chapel, but it really wasn't. It was a room in Elizabeth's home, and she gave it to Angela for her use, and it became a holy place for the company as it accumulated. And so Elizabeth had painted on the walls, at Angela's wishes, the pictures of some very important women. And so it kind of gives you a feel of what Angela was growing into when you think about the women whom she chose to have painted on that wall. One of them was Paula of Rome, and she was a wealthy woman, and her daughter's name, I think it sounds like an ear disease, Eustaquia. So it was Paula and Eustaquia. And they did the church a great favor. They took care of Saint Jerome, who was a bit of a, from what I read, he was a bit of an oddball. And, he needed somebody to make sure he got fed and clothed and whatever. And that's what Paula and Eustaquia did, that kind of ministry that they had. So Eustaquia was not married, but Paula obviously was. And then there was Saint Elizabeth, the one of great fame, who, had a robe full of roses because they wanted to know what she was doing, and she said she was feeding the poor. And so they made her open her cloak, and it was full of roses. And said about some other saints too. But Elizabeth was also queen, and she was married, and she had children, and she was a Franciscan Third Order member. So that was another connection. Of course, there was Saint Ursula, who was the patron of young women, because she and her 10,000 virgins were martyrs. And we always laugh, 10,000 virgins, where would they have found 10,000 virgins in the 8th century? But interestingly, during the Second World War, Cologne, which is where they were supposed to have been martyred, Cologne, of course, was bombed by the Allies, and a lot of things were destroyed. And as they were breaking through the rubble, they came across a graveyard. And sure enough, there she was, 10X, virgins, VM. Well, you can translate those Roman numerals more ways than one. But so instead of having 10,000 virgins, you had 10 virgin martyrs, which makes a whole lot more sense. Because the story of Ursula was that Ursula was from what we would call United Kingdom now. And her father was either a king or a wealthy whatever. And so he wanted her to marry this fellow, a wealthy prince or whatever he was. And Ursula wasn't sure she wanted to get married. So he said, go ask the Holy Father. Now, isn't that interesting? Just take off from the north, go up the North Sea and come down to Europe and go talk to the Holy Father. I don't know that people can do that today, but that's what apparently she was going to do. So he built 10,000 ships for her, if there were 10,000 of them. So they put 1,000 on each ship, and away they sailed, and they came down to Cologne. They came from Cologne down to Rome, talked to the Holy Father, and he said, stay a virgin. So the guy whom she was supposed to marry was with him. And he was very docile, if that's what the Holy Father said. Okay. But he remained in the group. And they went back up to Cologne to go home. And the Huns, who were barbarians, that's the word they use, vicious men, killed them all. So we have this statue up in the chapel court of, what's her name, Ursula, with an arrow in her chest. this is an aside that shouldn't go in. The arrow comes out. It's terrible. You can pull it out. And it has been known that members of the congregation have pulled it out and hidden it on occasion. I check it every once in a while. It still comes out, but it's still there. Anyway, so we have Ursula over there. Now, she became very important to Angela, partly because of her influence about virgins and martyrdom, that kind of love that led her to martyrdom. In fact, she was very important in her day, and there are many of the universities, University of Paris being one, for whom she was the model or the patron of those institutions of learning. So she was always connected with education. I don't know why, but that's a fact. Anyway, so her picture was there. So it's Paula at Eustaquia, and Ursula and Elizabeth, and then one who also is very important to us, a woman who was a scholar, interestingly enough. And she was a beautiful, wealthy woman and very educated. Catherine of Alexandria. She's important to us because her feast day is November 25th, and that's what we call Foundation Day, because Angela took her first daughters and they became a company officially on Catherine's feast day, November 25th. Anyway, so there that many people we know were on the wall. So it's like, she's always connected to women. And then you wonder, how come? What was it that attracted her? They were all different. Some were virgins. Well, many of them were martyrs, but not all of them. And so it's like, there's no one thing that attracted her to those women. But there they were in the oratory that Elizabeth Prato had built for her. So there you got Angela, something about her. And then you've got Angela's women friends. And then that leads me always to hospitality. Because I know men are hospitable too. I don't mean to imply they're not. But it seems as though hospitality is connected to women. Maybe because food is often connected to women, and to, you invite friends in and you have good fun with them, good conversation. So obviously, Angela was a hospitable person. Why else would people have liked her? You are not drawn to people who are stingy and mean, close-fisted, but to people who are open and friendly and accepting of who you are. And where else do you do that so freely except at a table? Because you only invite your friends to the table and you feed them with what you like and with what you know they like. So it's connected to food and friendship. Angela is said never to have drunk wine. I can't imagine a good Italian not drinking wine, but that's the story. So we just leave that one alone. But I suspect she served wine. So there is Angela friends, especially women friends, and hospitality. So I always like to ask people, think about who your friends are, especially your women friends. What attracts you to them, and why is it that you hold that friendship? My best friend was a woman I grew up with. I loved her dearly. She was as close as my sister. We started going to school together, maybe the third grade, I'm not sure, somewhere in there. And so I stayed, we were friends all through high school. She got married. By that time, I was in the novitiate. And scandal of scandals, she and her husband came to visit me on her wedding day. And I didn't think they would let her in. She was in her wedding dress. Sure enough, I got to see her on her wedding day. And so she named one of her children, it's a boy, she called him Marty. She called me and said, I want you to come, I'm dying. I want you to come be with me and help me prepare my funeral. I was stunned, but our friendship lasted all the way through school, into married life, religious life, and parenthood, spiritual or otherwise, all the way to her death. We buried her from the Mother House Chapel, and I got to give a homily. So it was like, friendships last forever, whether you really stay in contact or not. But somewhere there's a place in our heart for all our friends, our women friends, men friends too, but women friends. So I always like to ask people, think about your friends. Who are they? How do you hold them in your heart? How do they hold you in their heart? Because friends, mutual. Friendship is mutual. So there are some questions or thoughts. How are you hospitable? Because I think everybody's hospitable if they're whole people. But people show their hospitality in different ways. And we have talked about that before. I live with an Italian sister, and hospitality means one thing to her and something else to me. But they're both right. My family was very hospitable. My friend's sister always talks about how hospitable her family was. And sometimes I want to say to her, that's only one way to be hospitable. There's more than one way, because it's the welcoming and the friendship and the love that goes between friends that makes them hospitable. Hospitality was so important to Angela that she had this saying, I love the Italian, it's siate piacevole. Be peaceful. Be like a piazza, a place that is open and welcoming. You can come in and go out. You can come in, but you don't have to stay. You go back out. It's in and out, that kind of openness. So be like a piazza, she says. And I always think it means get in touch with your own hospitality. What is yours like? Don't compare it to anybody else's. What's yours like? Okay, eventually we're going to talk about spirituality more directly. We're going to talk about image of self and image of God, image of other people. See how that's all bound together? Because who I think I am has a lot to do with the way I'm going to treat you. Because if I don't like myself, I probably won't like you. It goes that way, doesn't it? But if I'm satisfied with who I am and love who I am, then I'll love you because you're not a threat. That's how friendships are formed. I was thinking about this last night. You know the sign, the infinity sign? It's kind of like that when we talk about eventually Angela's charism. It's not all about loving God, and it's not all about serving other people. It's like the infinity sign. It's both. And they're wound together. You can't do one without the other and have it genuine.
Right.
So we're going to talk about that further, because that is very important. Sometimes I get really squirmy when people talk about doing good things. I get tired of do-gooders. It depends where that comes from. It could be all for me. I'll take care of you because I will really look good. Not so blatant to that, but sometimes it's underneath it. And I could also be holy all by myself. Go on and close the door and not have anything to do with anybody else. Well, I don't know where that would come from either, because I can't really love God and not love other people. It's that infinity sign. Okay, now we'll stop a minute if you want to say anything and talk about hospitality. I know I've got one good Italian here. I know Jenny with a name like Schaefer has got to be German
There's a little
somewhere.
German in there.
Yeah. And I'm not sure about Olsen, but it sounds,
Scandinavian, it's Norwegian.
that's what I thought.
Okay.
But I bet you could all have different kinds of family stories and your own practice of welcoming others. I mean, you're women. And you know what that's like.
Mhm.
You want to say anything about your experience of Angela and her hospitality next to yours? Not comparing them, but part of the same thing.
I think one of the things that draws me to Angela is that she was hospitable to people who others shunned, like the incurables, the people with the syphilis, the French disease, that if I understand correctly, she helped care for them in one of these hostels or hospitals that, and so that, that really caught my attention, and I'm not out there caring for people with incurable diseases, but one of the things that I try to do is make eye contact and smile at people who, like the person in the McDonald's drive-thru or the checkout clerk at Kroger's. People who just normally, I don't think, others necessarily give them the time of day.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things that I think Angela, who are the people that don't get the time of day?
Yeah.
And how can I be hospitable to them? Well, one thing I can do is make eye contact and smile.
Right.
We
We can all do that.
can all do
That's
that.
But boy, a lot of people just ache for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, just that general kindness. I think in my case, of course, food has a lot to do with it. I love to feed people. I think that's something that that gives me joy. But I would say that one thing about Saint Angela that I just really appreciate is that when she talked about being like a piazza, it was like having no strings attached.
Yes.
So loving people and accepting them for who they are, but not expecting really anything in return, not necessarily having any kind of conditions on that love. And I would like to live up to that. That is what I hope to be, is the type of person that can love others as individuals and also without any strings attached.
Yes. I
That's
was
the
going to say,
big one.
kind of to follow up on that, or I would like to be like that as well, but I think she met them where they were. And she wasn't trying to fix them. She was trying to be in community. And I think sometimes there are strings attached to our love. Oh, well, I'll make your life better, or I can do this. And back to what you said, Jenny, I think people just want that respect, and they deserve that respect. And I think we should have reverence like St. Angela did.
Right, right.
Because we are a group of fixers, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
It's like that's how our
Yes.
generosity and all that overwhelms other people want to fix you. You need this, and this, I'll fix you.
Right,
And that comes out of a good place.
right.
But then it's not always self-reflective.
Or does it come out of a good place? Because we need to feel better about it. I don't know.
Right.
Right.
But that idea of loving each person as a unique creature of God, that is very inspiring as well. I think about, I have 4 children, and they're each their own snowflake. I mean, even though they came from the same parents and lived in the same home, they are uniquely different. And I found when, helping raise them, that disciplining them all the same, that didn't work, or encouraging them all the same. They each required something different. And I really take a lot of inspiration from her idea of loving people and seeing them for who they are as one unique creature. I think that's really something to live up to, and it's very inspiring. And I think it also speaks to hospitality. If you have a party, you're not going to just put out food you like, or you're not going to just, make people sit in a room that you're comfortable in. You're going to want to accommodate other people and make them feel at home. And so, similarly, I think that idea of really paying attention to the other is exciting
Yes.
and inspiring.
Yes, and beautiful. Beautiful, precious. And people found that attractive. Because, as you said, we don't meet that everywhere.
Right.
And people hunger for that, whether they name it or not. Something really interesting happened yesterday. You know how hot it was.
Oh, yeah.
Jeanette had gone to the grocery, and when she came back, she said, I just got to drop the food and go. She said, I have to get a couple of bottles of water. She said, I saw a man out on the street. He was lying on the ground. He had a bicycle, and she said he was asleep. And she said, something didn't seem right to me. I got to go back and see if she's okay, if he's okay. So she left, and she was gone quite a while. When she came back, I said, well, what happened? And she said, I gave him the water. He said he was okay, but he was so hot, he just had to quit, get off the bicycle, and lie down, which of course was not a real good idea. But the water was good, so she called 911, and she met with such gracious response from 911. Of course, they had questions like, is he alive? Is he hurt? And some of that she didn't know. They said, we'll be right there, we'll take care of him. Now, that just really touched me. Now, it didn't surprise me that she did that, because that's how she is. But somehow she was impressed with how the 911 operator responded to her and to the man who was in need.
Right.
So they were going to come. She said before she got home, she heard the siren of the ambulance coming to see how he was. And hopefully, he was just a little hot and needed some help cooling down. But we'll never know. She didn't know the man's name. She'll probably never see him again. And he never saw her, really. He probably wouldn't recognize her. But that's how love spreads. Like, so to be open to the needs of others, no matter what they are. A kid you meet on the street who needs like a welcoming smile, a pat on the head, or whatever. Is there something I can do for you? So no matter what that looks like, that comes out of heart of love. That's the part of the charism that we sometimes overlook. What's the heart like that all that good stuff's coming out of? What a thing to think about. So, thank you all very much, and we'll get back together. This group may not get back together, but we will continue this conversation.
Thank you.
Next.
Thank you,
Thank
Sister
you.
Martha.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome back to our conversation about Saint Angela Merici. And today we welcome Babe Baltus, who is the director of the Associate Community. And we're really happy to have her. Last week she wasn't available. And this week, Janet Marie is not available. So our group will change a little bit here and there, which is fine because you're here. Today we're going to talk about, last week we talked about Angela as woman and of her women friends and hospitality. We talked a lot about what that was like and how different people have different styles of hospitality, but that certainly was one of Angela's qualities and kind of gets expressed in her telling us to be like a piazza, because piazzas are hospitable places. So today we're going to, in a way, backtrack to, in some ways, kind of started her off. And so the topic today is the vision at Brudazzo. Now, Brudazzo isn't really a town. It's an area outside of Desenzano. So it's still in the Lake Garda area. And it's closer maybe to the farm where Angela's father had his farm. Talking about farms, you have to understand about farms because we Americans think of farms as great tracts of land, whereas in Angela's day, her father's farm was probably the size of a square block, so not very large. And there was a path all around it, as around all the rest of them in the area. So all the farmers were kind of there with their own crops. Wheat, a lot. I don't know what else, alfalfa maybe. Probably a lot of weeds, but it was more or less small. Okay, so the vision that Angela had took place in Brudazzo, which is near the farm area. And the thing about this, did you ever play that game where you start out and say, Amy would be the beginner, and she'd start out with a sentence, and she'd tell Amy, and Amy would tell me, and I'd tell Bay, and they at least would have to tell us what she heard.
Yes.
And most often, it wouldn't be anywhere near how we started. There'd be some grain of truth, maybe a word or a phrase that kept being passed around. So, in a way, that's how it is with Angela's vision. It was a very significant experience that she had. When she had it is under dispute. I've heard everywhere from 14 to 21. So how old was she? Depends where the story started. And we know that it happened in this area in Brudazzo. And now there's a marker there that says it took place here. But, you know, that's one of those rumors, too. It took place in that area. And there are also different descriptions of what the vision was. One of the strains that kind of has held on is that there was a ladder or a stairway connected, and there were young women and angels in some of the stories walking up and down the stairway or ladder. I have a friend who wrote a very interesting poem about it, and she said, this was early afternoon when you're supposed to be taking a siesta, and the kids had been working, young farmhands had been working all day, climbing up on the trees and shaking down apples, I guess, shaking them down. Olives, sure that's what it would be, olives. So they were shaking down the olives, the girls were putting them in their aprons and then taking them over them. So if you were half asleep and you were watching that, you would get this image of people going up and down, bringing something down and being happy about what they were bringing. So, you know, I like the poem. I have no idea if it anywhere came near the truth, but it's kind of a version, you know, like if Amy started telling the story, Lisa might end up with olives. I don't know. So whatever happened, the grain of truth in the whole story was that Angela had a profound religious experience. Now, there's some who say that God told her that she was supposed to found a teaching order of nuns. Now, we know that was not part of it. Not quite. Although you read it in a lot of accounts of her life. But anyway, we do know that somehow this experience of whatever it was an experience of God's presence that revealed to her God's unconditional love for her. Now, you know God loves you. I know God loves me. I know God loves all of us. But there are experiences of that love that vary. And so the one that Angela had was very profound and affected the rest of her life. I like to call it a seed experience, that out of which everything else grew. And it's important, you know, to kind of remember your seed experiences. I've had a couple, you know, that have changed my life or formed my life or however you want to call it. I could not tell you everything, whether it was a ladder involved, I don't think there was, or olives. But there were times that I could say, this was a very important moment for me, and maybe it, you know, focused my life. So that's what happened essentially at Brudazzo. Another little piece that gets added a lot, and because it's added almost every story, it's probably true. Angela had lost her sister. This is not the Black Plague. You have to make sure that was all over and done with by the time Angela lived. But they still didn't know very much about disease. And so oftentimes a disease would come into a village and wipe out the whole village.
Right.
Because they didn't know how to take care of the people. They didn't know about dirt or vermin or whatever. So that didn't help at all. So unfortunately, Angela's sister died in one of these episodes. Now, Angela and her sister, who apparently was a little older than she was. Angela had an older brother, and then her sister, and then Angela, and then a little brother, so far as we know. anyway, she and her sister were very close, and apparently they were also very different because her sister was the mischievous kind, and there were very strict laws about not walking on anybody else's farm. Now, because, there was blocked off like that and there was a path around, you followed the path. You did not cut across the neighbor's farm. There was a law against it. And you think laws are strange. Well, that always seemed like a strange law to me. But anyway, it carried a fine. And there was a book in which they have found. Can you believe that? It's still extant. It was in the council room or the city hall or whatever. And so it had listed all the people who had committed offenses. Now, Angela's brothers were both in there, and either the judge wrote off the offense, or else Mr. Merici had to pay, I don't know how much the money was, but he had to pay something. Angela's sister's name was there. So Angela's name was not there. So, I don't know what that says. Maybe it doesn't, maybe it doesn't say anything. Maybe the judge liked her and he never put her name down. But anyway, Angela seems to have worried about her sister when she died. Was she in heaven? Or was she not in heaven? So there's always in this story of the vision that her sister was one of the women, the girls walking up and down that ladder. So that settled that for Angela and was a great relief for her, because I guess if I thought my sister might not be in heaven, I'd worry about that too. But anyway, that seems to be a consistent part of the story. But how old she was, when exactly it happened, and then another question is, how many times did it happen? Because you will read about a second vision, but there's no proof or a verifiable fact that there was a second vision. I'm glad for that, because, one vision ought to do you, right? Anyway, but it changed her life. And the way it changed her life was not maybe in a way that other people knew, but she came to know that God loved her in such a way that she developed a great sense of freedom of spirit. It increased her simplicity and her joy, which made her very attractive. People flocked to her, even when she was a younger woman, because she radiated joy and happiness and goodness. She was just a good person. So many things refer back to that moment of vision. Later in her life, she confided to some of her close friends the fact of that vision. So this is not something that people just made up, because in the process of beatification, whatever, there are meetings held where people who knew the person are questioned, and they swear to their testament. And so there is something, there are written accounts of the vision, but it's very bare-boned. It doesn't say she had 2 or 3 or nothing, except that she knew from then on God's love for her. So that was a seed experience, and she went through her whole life knowing profoundly that God loved her. Now, because, when you know God loves you, well, I look around and I think, he probably loves you too. And if he loves you, he really loves you, because God doesn't just like, I kind of love you. If I love you with all that I am. And so that changes a person, right? It changes my attitude, or your attitude toward your family, towards people you meet on the street, maybe people you don't particularly care for, but it alters that. It kills prejudice, because if I know how lovable you are, how can I hate you or bear ill will against you? So that profound experience that she had, and whatever that was, whatever vision, I call it a vision because that's what she called it. that's very important to remember about her. It made her free. And there's nothing like inner freedom to make you a different person. It makes you attractive, for one thing. It also, people, without saying, know that you're not judging them. And to know that you're with someone who does not judge you is a freeing experience for you. So it's something really important to remember about the vision. The details, you know, by the time you get around, there's olives. But whatever it is, don't lose the fact that she knew in her bones that she was loved by God unconditionally. Okay, now I also want to talk a bit about charism. We didn't talk about that last week. And charism is very important, and it's attached in some ways to that seed experience that she had. As you well know, a charism is a gift. And the way the church has looked at it, well, it's related to charismatic people. You know, people who have charisma, or you say, oh, she's charismatic. It means that they have a power, a gift for touching other people in some way. So the church has looked at Angela and tried to describe her charism. Well, it was really neat. After Second Vatican Council, all religious were instructed to discover and claim the charism of their founder or foundress. I have to say that before then, we never used that word. I never heard of it. So we got this group of sisters together. It was the best committee I ever belonged to. I'm not a committee lover, but that one was really a life-changing experience because we talked about what was her charism. Well, sitting around that room, we were all teachers. So we said, must be teaching. And we said, no, that isn't it. It's something more than that, something deeper than that. So we thought and thought and thought. I remember Sister Helen O'Brien came up with a couple of the words that are still in that statement. And we kept saying, okay, she obviously was a person of deep love. And she loved God profoundly because she knew that God loved her profoundly. So we didn't know what to call that. So we called that contemplative love because contemplative love is deep. And it's a product of reflection and experience and trusting one's experience. So, okay, we like that. Okay, so she had a contemplative love for God. There we sat as teachers saying, yeah, so then what? So then we said, okay, because of that, as a result of that, she had an openness, and this is the word, Helen, and eagerness, an openness and eagerness to serve the needs of others. Because any love that comes to us that's deep and profound, we have to share it. It has to go out. We don't hold it to ourselves. When Jesus called his disciples, he always asked them, what do you want? It was always his question, always jars me. Isn't that a strange thing to ask? First thing you say to somebody, well, what do you want? It all depends on how you say that.
Yeah, depends on if they're a door-to-door salesman.
Exactly. So he said to the first guys that came along, what are you thinking? What do you want? And they said to him, where do you live? Now that's really interesting. They didn't say, what do you do? Or where are you from? It's like, where do you live? Now that's a very profound question because I could tell you I live at 3117 Dogwood Drive, but there's much more to where I live than that address. So those guys somehow knew that Jesus was talking about something more than just where do you hang your hat. So when they said, where do you live? He said, come and see. So it's like an invitation to the experience. Come and see. You'll see where I live. You'll see who I am, what I do, how I treat others, what makes me tick. Come and see. And then it took them a while to catch on, although when you continue to read Scripture, you wonder if they ever caught on. After a while, he sent them out. So he didn't just say, okay, guys, here we are, all knowing who we are and loving each other and knowing where we live. Now go and tell. Go tell other people so they know who they are and that they're loved. So finally, he sends them out two by two. It's always 2 by 2. There's all kinds of things written about that. Was it husband and wife? Or those 2 buddies? Are they father and son? Who were they? No idea. Really, no idea. But there were 2 of them. And so he sent them out 2 by 2 and told them, go to all the villages, cure the sick, preach the good news. And what was the good news? You were totally loved by the Father. So they did. Well, they came back after a while, all 72 of them, just like little boys. I laugh. I think what that must have looked like. All these guys coming back, and they were full of themselves. Oh, they said to Jesus, you wouldn't believe it. The devils were obedient. These people, we cured all these people, and everybody was all jolly and happy, and Jesus was enjoying it. I love that section. It's the only place in Luke where it says Jesus rejoiced in the Spirit. Now, I don't know whether he had a big belly laugh. I don't know what rejoicing in the Spirit looks like when it spells out. Maybe it's jumping up and down. I don't know. But anyway, Jesus was filled with the joy of the Spirit. And he said to them, don't rejoice because the devils are subject to you, but rejoice because your names are written in the book of life. Now that's that same idea. Your names are written in the book of life. So what is life? Let's come and see. That's where your names are written in the book of life. Jesus said, I've come that you may have life and have it to the full. So Jesus is a lot about life. And so he said to the disciples, that's why you should really be happy, because your names are, you're in. You got your name written in the book of life. So it's like Jesus did that same thing. He called the disciples, and they, with him, learned about contemplative prayer, a deep love for God, which was really like a seed for some of them, because it seems like they really never got it until the Holy Spirit came. Then they got it. But anyway, he didn't send them out until he had shown them where he lived. So in a way, that was his charism also, a contemplative love for God with a resulting openness and eagerness to serve the needs of others. So that's what Angela did. She had a period in her life after the vision. The rest of her family died, I guess in the same illness or maybe a different one, but the rest of them died except her little brother. And so there she was. How old was she? Who knows? So she took over the family farm. So she was not a child. She had to have been, a young adult. And she had this little kid to watch over. So she takes him and herself to their aunt and uncle who lived in a different town nearby, said hello. And they were a step up in society. Their name was Biancosi. And Uncle and Aunt Biancosi were, a little bit more well-to-do. Don't know what their occupation was, but probably not farming. And so she was introduced to a different style of life. And so she learned to do all the things that ladies did. She learned to sew and entertain. I don't know, make bread. I don't know what fine ladies do, but a little bit more. Yes. And so it was a different way of living, but the people around her came to love her in the same way as the others had done, because she had that openness and eagerness to serve the needs of others, not her own, which is important, but the needs of others. She also ran into the Franciscans at that point. Selo is a little fishing town, and across from it, I don't know how far away it is an island. And on the island, the Franciscans had a friary. And so, I don't know, I guess they rowed over or went over in a sailboat, I don't know, but there was a lot of communication there. So she went there and learned the spirit of Francis, which was already in her heart, that of love and simplicity and generosity and a largeness of life. That always impresses me about her. You know, here she was living from this little podunk town on a lake up in northern Italy. How did she know anything about anything? But she had a wide view of life. She went to the Holy Land. She went to Venice. And she went to all these other towns. I have to tell you about Varallo, which is a little shrine place. She went there, but she traveled a lot. So her vision of the world was not the little fishing village, because she had friends all over the place, dukes and whatever, not just fishermen, but all kinds of folks, which said something about her, you know, the expansive personality. You've met people like that?
Yeah.
It's wonderful. So anyway, the Franciscans kind of put, I don't know, bones or flesh or something around what she already knew. And probably she gained some good theology by being with them, and she became a third order member. Now, I don't know if associates are like third order members.
Yeah.
Probably
Not canonically, but
no.
in the relationship is close. So.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think so. I think so. If we have anything, well, they're, what do you call them? Oblates of Saint, what's his name? Benedict. Benedict and oblates are pretty well known, but so are third order Franciscans. I mean, they're around, but they're much more ordered, I guess. They have a rule to follow and all that. Whereas associates, it's an association of affection, relationship among a group of mostly women, though men as well. So you're still living in that style of Angela. So because of the Franciscans, she got involved in the larger world. And they sent her out to go do this or that. And one of the things they did was send her to Brescia, which was the big town in the area. It was mercantile family area. There was a river there, and there was a mill. So there was a lot of, still they make clothing there. Every time I've been there, I've marveled at the shops they have where they sell baby clothes. I don't know, they seem to, you know, that's their big thing.
That's their
baby
specialty.
Clothes. Yeah, must be. Anyway, so it's always been a place of merchandising. So she went there, and that's where her friendship kind of exploded. And she got involved with an organization called Divina Amore, which means divine love. And it was a lay organization. I think they were all men, but I couldn't swear to that one. But they did charitable works. And she knew a lot of them, and she influenced a lot of them. Some of her friends that we named last week, like Agostino Gallo and Antonio Romano, they were members of Divino Amore. They built hospitals and things like that. They did charitable works. And something that I think is really important to reflect on, the official church, the ecclesiastical presence was rare. So simply wasn't there. So who was the church? The lay people, like they always have been. But every once in a while, that gets really, you know, you can't miss it. It hits you in the face because there weren't any priests. Occasionally, the bishop would come in and give a little spiritual thing like, give me your money. And then he would go away. They wouldn't see him anymore. Now, there were a number of really loving priests who really were pastoral. So I don't want to dismiss the church. But the hierarchy was definitely missing, just wasn't present. But she worked within that framework, and that's when she started meeting all these people, the guys from Avino More, especially. Okay, now those are two things I really wanted to talk about, was the vision and how that God played out in her life through the charism that she has handed down. She didn't hold that one to herself either. Like Jesus, she put it out there. And people have always been attracted to that because it's very Christian, but it's also, I don't know, that's my bias. I think it has a feminine feel to it because, the sisters have been carrying this on forever. And it never worries me. People say, oh, don't you worry that there aren't any more sisters? No, it used to be there never were any. But what happened is that there has always been a drawing to that contemplative love for God with an openness and eagerness to serve the needs of others. That's how the church got started. That's who Jesus was, and that's who his followers were. You take the great saints. Francis of Assisi was like that. He gathered the friars and taught them about loving, and then he said, go love and say words if necessary. There's some kind of little, use words, preach the gospel, use words if you have to. That same idea of, the charism, it doesn't need words, it needs action.
Yes.
So the charisms, if they're not connected to the charism of Jesus, then there's something else. Now, it takes different forms. We don't need to do that, but you can think of all the religious and they're different. They have a different founding vision, I think. Okay?
Different calling.
A different calling. And it gets expressed in different ways. I've already told you the story about how our charism got put into the cloister. And the church had nothing to do with it. Please don't ever blame it on the church, because the church had nothing to do with it. The ladies up in Paris wanted a monastery. So she monasticized the girls who were following her. They said, no, we don't want to do this. And we still want to stay with the people, because that's how Angela was. And she said, well, there's no way you can do that in a monastery. And they said, oh, yes, there is. We could bring people in. So that's when they started bringing girls in. And that's when the teaching started. They had to get permission. I think this is interesting. They had to get permission from the government for women to teach. So they were going to bring these girls into the monastery. They better have permission from the king or whoever his representative was to teach. But they got all that cleared. But that's when we also, that group in Paris, got the whole monastic trappings. The vows, the cloister, the habit, all of that, and a mission, and a teaching mission. This is what you are to do. Well, they're the group that spread all over Europe. They're still all over Europe. Ursulines are everywhere, I swear. They're like garbage. They turn up everywhere. You can't, I don't mean that in a pejorative way. Because women,
They're like dandelions.
They're like, that's better. That's pretty. Okay, they're like dandelions. They crop up everywhere.
Right.
You don't even have to tend them. There they are. Because I've met women from Africa, Asia, North and South America, China. I've not met any Russian ones, but there are some. So they're everywhere, every continent. There are a lot of Indians, many of them, who are Ursulines, because that was the structure that was ready. The world was ready for that structure, especially women needed education. So that's where the charism kind of got channeled in that way, always out of a sense of deep love for God. That's what attracted me to it in the first place, that contemplative love for God. Okay, so, in a way, where did that come from? It came from Angela's vision, that she knew knew deep in her that God loved her, and that's not something you keep to yourself. If I'm deeply loved, unless I'm really weird about God, you are too. Mm-hmm. And if you are so deeply loved by God, hey, I love you too. Mm-hmm. I'm attracted to you and to all the world to see what I can do. Mm-hmm. Meet the needs of others. Serve the needs of the times. It's always been phrased like that. Mm-hmm. Okay, now, what experiences have you had as an associate that ties in with any of this that I've been talking about? I mean, this is not the first time you've heard this. Mm-hmm.
I'm always struck when we have associate gatherings that, there's such a diversity of women, old, young, black, white, Asian, etc., who are in the associate community here and elsewhere. We have a lot of associates in South America as well. The specific, works or involvement that these people have, mostly women, like you say, with their parishes and with the larger community. It's just really impressive.
It is. It really is. And you can't miss them.
No.
Whether they're identified, the ladies, I think, in South America wear a particular jacket or something. I'm not real sure. They don't wear a veil, but they're kind of identified, I think. But whether, like associates here are not identified, except
other than just the pin.
Yes,
and name tags. Right. But no, there's if you met one riding down the street, you wouldn't know.
Mm-hmm. No, except
until they spoke to you. Yes, their actions until they spoke to you.
Yeah.
Because I feel as if when I became an associate, I was searching for something and I found it through the formation, and then I think you want to share that with someone else. Mm-hmm. And I always say we're really a great kept secret, because I think so many people are searching and so many people are looking, and I'm just always amazed when we learn and we hear these things about Saint Angela, because it seems as if it could be in this era, not in the 1400s.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's very contemporary.
Very much. Yeah. That's exciting. I found that really exciting. This woman could have walked out of any door around here, and we'd say, she's really something. It would have been the attraction that we would have had toward her.
Yeah, and I love the fact that she could hold two very contrary notions together. One being that she knew God loved her, and yet also knowing that she was not always lovable, and that in her own kind of vulnerability, that's when God revealed himself to her. And I can relate to that. I feel like, we sometimes feel God's presence when we're praising and happy and joyful. But I've personally found refuge in God when times have been difficult. Yes. And I can really relate to her in that sense, where I would say, I now really feel that love washed over me. And yet I also know that in some ways I'm not deserving of that love, but God loves me anyway. And so those two contrary kinds of ideas, they still fit together.
Yes, they really do.
Yeah, and I think she really exemplifies that. She had the confidence to be full of love and to speak her mind in such a free way. And I like the way you described her vision as freeing her. I think that's something I'd like to think more about.
And I kind of tie in with what you're saying. I think that piece of us that maybe doesn't feel lovable is in contrast with, well, how could I go out then and show God to other people? Or how could I be the messenger? And so what you're saying is that those seed experiences and those times when it washes over us how loved we are, that allow us to want to share it. And I think that it did attract me to the Ursuline Associates program, because I I don't know that I would have, when I was younger, if I ever would have thought like I had what it takes to be, a sister, if I had what it takes to be in, like an ordained life or in that sacred life that was my image of being a nun. But what Saint Angela has taught me, and what this associates program has taught me, and what my interaction with the Ursulines has taught me, is that I am lovable, and that I have gifts, I have a charism, that through my own life, whatever that life looks like, whether it's in education or I'm in the business world, wherever I am, I have something to offer and a way to minister, to serve, because I am loved. But I think as a younger person, looking at all my options, I don't know that I would have ever seen myself, because of that piece, Lisa, that you're talking about, of maybe, I'm not really worthy of
feeling
this.
that, you're not worthy.
But I love what Angela shows us, that you don't have to be in a particular order. You could do what you can, where you can, when you can, and that is freeing, and that is empowering, to be able to share that. And I think that contemplative piece is the piece that I strive for daily, is to become more contemplative, so I can have those experiences where God's love just washes over me, so that I can share that freely.
Yeah.
Holiness takes many different forms.
Yes, yes.
So each face, and you look around, and everybody is so different, but everyone reflects God's goodness deeply. Sometimes whether they know it or not, you don't have to be a sister or a brother or a priest or a bishop or, God forbid, the Pope. That's just trappings. That doesn't say what's inside.
Right.
And so it's like the contemplative love that's inside gets shown outwardly, and you don't need to put a sign on it.
Right.
Exactly.
That's a good way to say it.
And it's ever evolving, because I think, especially as women, we find ourselves at different places in our life, whether we're raising children or we've raised our children, but that contemplative love is ever growing and ever changing. And as Lisa said, highs in our life and lows in our life. And it feels very safe.
Yeah.
And when you find something really amazing, you do want to share it. I think about lemon cream cake. That's like my favorite dessert of all time. And when I have a good one, I'm like, try this. It's so good. You have to try it. And it reminds me that, you don't want to hold it all to yourself.
Right.
You want to give it.
That's wonderful. I mean, you think about it. This is an exciting time, I think, when women, especially women, I think that's true of men also, but especially of women, where we are beginning to claim more deeply our own goodness and our own value of what we have, who we are.
And finding ways, unique to women to participate in church life.
Yes.
Because, obviously, because of the way things are organized, and we were talking about this earlier today, we're sort of we're totally cut off from being any part of
Being
the
ordained.
clergy, or being ordained. So we have to find our own path, and in many cases, break new ground.
Right. And haven't women always done that?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Always done that.
Right.
Always without making such a big deal or having to wear a red hat to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Or found a way to be in community.
Yes.
All right.
And to build consensus.
Yes, we do that around a table like this. That's why that symbol of those female figures is so important, because they're together. I don't know, that may have some kind of a name, I don't know. But that little set has been passed down from the leadership group for about 25 years, I think. They've been
really?
passing that down because it becomes, it's in the circle.
Yes.
And there are 5 of them, which is how many women are on the leadership, have been on.
Anytime, yes.
So
Wow.
they always use that kind of as a call to being together like that.
This kind of going off that, looking at that community, thinking about being around the table. This week at Mass, it was Trinity Sunday at Mass, and so our priest in his homily talked about how difficult it is to do that sermon on the Trinity because it's so difficult to understand. But I thought he said it best, a way I'd never thought about it, and I won't be able to repeat exactly how he put it. So in my own words, it's just the idea that the Trinity is relationship, and we as humans are hardwired to be in relationship. And I'd never really connected that. I know I'm hardwired to be in relationship because I'm very relational, but I never connected that back to the Trinity. And I think that looking at this symbol here on the table, thinking about how we as women, and men are associates too, but are sharing and, having that opportunity to share God's unconditional love in relationship,
Right.
and
Yeah.
knowing that's a part of our godliness.
And to be in a community that, unlike the larger community of the world, it is full of peace and loving kindness.
Right. That's wonderful. Because if anything our world needs is that,
Yes, exactly.
yes, spots of light, of hope.
Right.
Yeah. Our pastor talked about hope because the first reading was about hope. You got trouble and that leads to this and this leads to this, but that leads to hope.
Yes.
And that's kind of where we are
Right.
in many ways, personally,
That's true.
but in the church and in our government, we're looking for hope.
Right.
Well, and I'd like to think of Saint Angela, if she were alive today, she'd probably have something to say about climate change. She'd probably be out there, having zero waste in her living situation and, modeling through her example ways of loving not only every human, but also every creature and the earth itself. And because I just think, maybe because of her Franciscan ties as well, and I personally have a lot of affinity with the Franciscans, just think that is not disconnected from the love of people, because, we're all creations of God, and God created all of it. And, I just can imagine that, and this is part of my peace and justice work that I think about, is how could we call upon Saint Angela to help inspire us to really get going on, reversing or at least stemming the tide of, the degradation of our planet. And I bet she'd have something to say.
I think she would too. Maybe we need to talk to her about it more.
That's a good point.
One of the rules that they had in her little village about the farming was that they were not allowed to gather the twigs, which is really interesting. It was against the law to gather twigs from somebody else's property. And now we hire kids to do that. But see, they use that for fuel, for cooking and heating. So it's like their respect. You don't just go around taking people's livelihood.
That's right.
But you don't waste it.
And some of where our most amazing resources exist are among the poorest people of the earth. And are we going to respect their environment, or are we going to go and take it for ourselves?
Yes.
So,
Their knowledge.
I will get off of that.
Their knowledge of what is good for the earth.
Right.
Yes.
We kind of have lost that. I don't know.
Connectedness.
We all ought to be farmers, that we might learn something. What's good for the earth?
Yeah.
Because we don't really know that, too. I mean, you look at a city that's all concrete and steel. you can hardly see any earth to be good to.
That's true.
So she would have, I don't know what she would do with this world today. Hers was certainly filled with some of the same struggles,
Right. Yeah.
poverty and wealth. It was such an extreme.
Yes.
And
there was corruption.
the corruption,
Absolutely.
and you know, she was not Italian, you know that, because there was no Italy. Italy was not a nation.
like that.
City-states
City-states, so she was,
that often were at each other's throats
exactly, that's where all the wars were happening.
in between different dukes
Right.
and princes.
But I claim
Right.
her as Italian.
Don't take that away from Lisa.
Don't take that away. That's one of my touch points.
Yeah.
She's from the boot.
Right, she's from the boot. And I don't know whether she would have been considered Milanese because they were close to Milan.
True.
But she was as close to Milan as she was to Venice. So maybe she was considered herself Venetian. I don't know what those were all called. I don't know if Tuscany was not a city,
No.
but there was an area.
Florence is in Tuscany.
Yes,
Well,
yeah.
and Lake Garda and Sirmione and that area,
Yeah.
I don't know what that was called back in her day.
I don't either, but she was not Italian. None of them were actually. All those great saints.
Yeah.
They were something. They were great. They were great saints, but they did not
Identify.
talk about their nationality because they didn't have it.
Important.
Yeah, that wasn't a thing.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, we could learn something. from that.
Absolutely.
There's some history. May I take us back to the book?
Please do.
Because I want to make sure that this was something that we were talking about a little bit earlier. So we'll have to rewind to a few things. But this was something that to me was the key of the chapter. And I wanted to make sure to say it today. Where on page 20, for those who have the book, you write, our activities are not where our significance comes from, which is hard for me because I often think my significance comes from what I'm doing, particularly my profession. Our significance comes from the fact that God has laid hold of us and we know it. We know experientially how God has moved into our lives. As a result, our lives have meaning, a beauty, a unity, and an integrity hardly containable by our world. And I wrote in one of our other discussions next to this, two things that you said. You said, our significance is God. And how true is that? But to actually say it takes me back to understanding it or to knowing it. And you said, our gift to the world is how we know the Lord. And those were two things that really spoke to me in one of our earlier discussions over the last 3 years. I'm not sure which one, but it seems so evident, but sometimes that which is most evident or most simple is sometimes the most difficult to remember or to connect to. We complicate things.
Right.
But
We sure do.
if we just look at that, how simple is that? Our significance is God. Of course it is.
Right.
Yeah.
I just
No
wanted
wonder
to
she
bring
was
that.
attractive because she had that, joyful confidence that God loved her.
Yes. Yes.
And that's catching. You know,
It's catching.
Yeah.
it's catching.
And she lived simply because of that.
Yes. Right, what do you need?
Yeah.
If you know that, really.
And, other focused.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a quote I have. I don't know. It's hanging on in my office, so I'll try to remember to bring it the next time. So I'll misquote it, but the idea is, it says, our lives should be such that those who know us are drawn to praise God. And I hang that in my office because I think every day that, that's my reminder that those who know us are drawn to praise God. And that really is,
That's beautiful.
what this is. I think what this chapter is about.
Yeah, you're right.
That's really good.
In other words, if you'd started that out as a sentence for us to pass around, we'd have been finished long ago.
And there would have been no
Olives involved.
We wouldn't have gone
But we
down the
wouldn't have
olive
had
trail.
this rich discussion either. So the joy is in the process.
You started out today talking about her vision, and visions still happen. I mean, on the news this morning, on NPR. They were talking a man some of whose family members were murdered by Dylan Roof 3 years ago in Charleston. He was on the radio talking about, there's a book out now about how Grace Will Lead Us Home, about how many of the family members of the victims, forgave the murderer. And this man was talking, and he was emotionally very wrought. But he said he when he heard the news that his family member had been murdered, he said he was just so beaten down. He said he just couldn't stand. He just felt like he wanted to die. And he said he was there all by himself, but he heard this voice saying, "Get up." And he's looking around like, there's nobody here but me. And the voice kept saying, "Get up, get up." And he said he realized that it was God telling him to get up. And so he did. And he said, he didn't see anything. Maybe, I guess visions can be oral as well.
Absolutely.
But he said he got up, and he said he had such a wave of peace come over him that he said that happened 3 years ago, and he said, I still feel it today.
I believe that.
So,
Yeah.
it's not some esoteric thing, having a vision. God touches people every day.
That's right.
They just might not realize it maybe until later.
Right. Yes. Awareness is everything.
Yes.
Pay attention. Jesus said that a whole lot. And he said that more than he said, love one another. When you read Scripture, he's always saying that. Have I been with you such a long time and you don't even get it? And Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And then he said to the disciples, blessed are you because you have seen. Blessed are you because you have heard. So it's like paying attention. And that's what contemplation means, paying attention. In fact, I think that's what I read about this morning when I was reading, while I was praying, I was reading a daily reading that I get, and that's what it was about, paying attention. Paying attention. It's the big word for us today, I think. Pay attention. It's so hard for us to concentrate. I look at little children and I think, when do they ever slow down to reflect? But on the other hand, I have seen little children caught, and it's got to be contemplation, I don't know what else you call it, at the tiniest things, like totally absorbed in the way that ant is moving.
Right.
So absorbed in it. They may wiggle all over the place in the classroom. But there are times when they hone in on something, and I think that's being contemplative. So that's in all of us. We all have that. We got to cultivate it.
Absolutely.
Okay, I thank you all very much. This was a very enjoyable conversation.
Thank you.
And next time we're going to do, actually, it's the core of Angela's spirituality. Good morning or afternoon, whatever the case may be. Welcome back to our conversations. Welcome Babe Baltus, who was here with us last week, and Sister Janet Marie Peterworth, who was here 2 weeks ago, and Virginia Schaefer, this is the first time. So welcome, Jenny. Today we're going to talk about, basically, Angela's spirituality. And in the book, it covers chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now, I may not get all of that accomplished in this hour, and so what I don't get accomplished, we'll do the next time. So here we go. Spirituality is actually very important for all of us, and I've talked to many groups where people will say, I don't have any spirituality, which of course is not. Well, it depends on what you call spirituality. I'm not sure how an accurate definition of it, but there's a description that I like to use that I learned a long time ago from a very wise sister of Notre Dame. And we learned that spirituality has to do with the way we stand in reality. Without judgment, just how do I stand in reality? Face to face to myself and to God and to other people and to creation. So that's my spirituality. And it's neither good, bad, or indifferent. It just is. So I could never say to anybody, mine's better than yours, or yours is better than mine. It's just what is. And when I think about my stance toward myself and God, others, and creation, I may decide, well, I don't treat creation the way I really want to. Then I change it. So if I don't care for the way I treat other people, then I change that. I may have to work on that my whole life. But it's something that's moving, and it's always, what do I want? What do I want to be as I stand in reality? I went to yoga this morning, and the most interesting thing happened because the teacher used a word I've never heard before, and I could never repeat it, but it has to do how you stand in reality. And I thought, well, Albie, isn't that interesting? I would call that spirituality, but that is not what she called it. It has to do with your body person. So always be aware of your feet, she said. Okay, we're gonna start with Angela's images and her spirituality. And I've always tried to use her rule because the rule gives us her words about herself and God and others. She doesn't talk much about creation, but that may have to do with the time she lived in the 16th century. Okay, so I searched her rule to see what she said about God. And, I say to people, who do you think God is? That's a very important question. I have to admit that I often ask that question when I hear preachers. I think, who do you think God is that you're talking like this? Or, do you know the same God I know? Anyway, that's a logical question. So I asked Angela, okay, who did you think God is? Well, I went through her writings, and I found that, like most of us, she had more than one name she gave God. And so she called God His Majesty, His Divine Majesty. But the most intimate of her titles for God was Lover. Now, that's a far distance, it seems like, from Divine Majesty to Lover. But she includes all of that in her conversation that I found names for that she gave to God. So those are two stances before God, one of awe and reverence, which I came before Divine Majesty. I'd be a little bit awed. But Lover is an altogether different stance, and it speaks of intimacy, tenderness, passion, all those things that we associate with love, being a lover. And so then this goes into the second question, like, who do you think other people are? Because when she calls God my lover, she always says, or rather, lover of us all. Now, that's an extension, so she recognizes that other people have that same relationship with God. God has that same relationship with them. So we're all called to that kind of deep intimacy as lover to lover. And that is something to think about. I used to think, I'll never think of God as my lover. I have images of God as Sacred Heart, which is, depending upon the art, it's a gentle, loving kind of image, or Good Shepherd. And I have seen pictures of Jesus preaching, but I had never thought I'd ever want to call God my lover. But you know what? I guess if you live long enough, at least for me anyway, If I lived long enough, I got there. And so now that's a very appealing title or stance before God, because that makes God very close and intimate. Passionate is the word. God was supposed to have said to one of the saints, I think it was Angela of Foligno, who was a friend of Angela Merci's. God is supposed to have said to her, Angela, my love for you is no joke, which means, I mean this. This is not just fluffy stuff. I love you. So apparently Angela had that experience of knowing God's passionate, loving, gentleness, fidelity, all those things that we associate with love.
But Martha, one of the things that I struggle with, I recognize that Jesus is the reflection of God, but the separation that I grew up with anyway was God appear as Father. I could see God as divine majesty. I don't think of Jesus as Father, and I don't think of Jesus as divine majesty. I think of Jesus more as a shepherd and that kind of thing. So maybe it's my compartmentalization of the Trinity, but can you speak to that a little bit in terms of it's easier to see Jesus as a lover, in fact, a spouse of Christ. They sang that to us many long years ago, and that's really what sort of the theology was of that notion. So anyway, can you say something about that?
Well, yes, because Jesus says himself, as the Father has loved me, so I love you. And then he says to his disciples, ask your Father, he loves you. He loves you. So in the unity of the Trinity, Jesus opens a whole new way of seeing God as Father, as loving, as intimate, wanting a relationship with us. And Jesus made that visible, but it was always there. When I first learned that creation, the Big Bang, was the first incarnation, that makes everything really look different. To know that when Jesus was born, that was the second incarnation. But creation was the first. And so many worship ceremonies handed on to us by our native fathers and mothers include creation and include God as Father, as Mother, as Nurturer, all of that. So I think many of I don't like to call them primitive, early, prehistory folks knew a whole lot more about God than we do. And sometimes we kind of push that aside without examining what the people were saying about God.
Do you think Angela had any kind of an idea of God as mother, like Julian of Norwich spoke often of God as mother? I don't see any evidence of that.
No, but I don't know that she didn't feel that way. She had a loving relationship with her own mother, and then she had a lot of lady friends, women friends, and then she was close to the earth because she was a farmer. So she was aware of the seasons and of the fruitfulness, plantings, so on. So in her day, those words were not used, so far as I know, anywhere, except, no, that's Mary. See, and then Mary enters this whole thing. I came to realize the medieval Christian artists never portrayed a woman's body except in Mary, because she was the one, the nurturing one, There's one picture I saw where there's a picture of Mary holding her breast out and the milk is coming out and she's feeding us as a mother. Well, it doesn't take much of an imagination to see we were looking for a female representation of God, and Mary filled that. Not believing that Mary was God, but she was somebody special who showed us God's love in a female way as a mother. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of conversation about that now that maybe was shunned before. But then there was Julian of Norwich, as you say, and that's the beautiful things that she said about Jesus, my mother. So, gives us something to think about. Maybe it is more comforting to us to embrace God as mother, as female, because God is female as much as God is male. Though coming out of a patriarchal world, I mean, you look at the Roman world, the women were just nothing, hardly a smidge above a slave. And as time has gone on, it has remained that way and intensified, and we have it today. We live in a patriarchal society. Sometimes I think we're right on the edge of breaking through that, and then people get their heads bumped on the glass ceiling. But we're moving in that direction, I like to think. Anyway, Angela never calls God or Jesus mother, but she also sees God as nurturing and as loving. So did she have a female image of God? Probably not consciously. At least she never told us that. Okay. But how we see God is so important. Keep asking yourself that with trying not to judge, because if somebody grew up with a strictly patriarchal image of God, that's how they're going to act and speak of God. And I can't judge that because I didn't have that kind of background. I always thought my mother was a good mother of God because she had an ample bosom. And all the statues of Mary I ever grew up with were marble and pretty hard and kind of neutered look, but not my mother. And when I came to the conclusion that the sisters really did not know everything, I would go to my mother's bosom and she would tell me that. The sisters don't know everything. Now, this is how God is. And as I get older, man, she was right on. At least that's how I've come to see God. But it's a good thing to ask yourself, really, who do you think God is? Not lip service. Oh, God is mother, father, sister, brother, all the rest of that. Yeah. But deep in my gut, how am I toward God? And I think that changes. That's why I like to say to people, all things being equal, older is better. Because I can look back over a longer life and see how God was different, or how I saw God as different. But the different or the same, it's important to me as a person that I know how I see God. And so if I'm going to understand Angela and want to imitate her as a woman, especially, I need to know how she looked at God. Okay, that's that one. Okay, then there's self. How do I stand in relationship with self? Now, there's a connection among all of these naturally because the individual stands there in those relationships, and it's that same person who's in relationship to everything else. So how I see myself certainly affects the way I see myself. So I asked Angela, what did you think of yourself? Well, it's interesting because you can find all kinds of examples if you're looking for them. She speaks very highly of herself and with great confidence because she claims to be the mother of the company. She calls them my daughters, my sisters, and so, she had a pretty good self-image. And she says to them, I'll always be in your midst. I got it made. I'll be here for you always. Don't worry, I'm here. So that's pretty good self-image. Maybe we could see about our grandmothers. She's always with me. Well, so that grandmother probably had a pretty good self-image too. If she could say to her grandchildren, don't worry, Grammy's always here for you. So apparently she had a very positive self-image. She was independent. She did so many things in her life that ordinary women did not do. She was not educated, though she could read, and that opened a whole world to her. This is right about the time when the printing press was getting quite imposing upon reality. So her father used to read to them the lives of the saints and from the scripture. And when you read her readings, they're shot through with the feel of scripture. There's sometimes, and I think you could say that about the letter to the Ephesians. Sometimes it's like, who said that? Paul said that. Who said that? Angela said that. Well, I'll be. They both have that same, I know God, so I can tell you about God. So she has a strong, positive self-image. Okay. On the other hand, when you read her chapter on prayer, it's like, who is she talking about? Because she uses all those images that kind of go along, kind of go along with the times that we have read about, when I'm a worm and no man and that kind of thing. And it's like she saw herself as a dreadful sinner. She was sorry for her sins and the sins of her parents and her family. And so there's this, and another person, it would sound like a very negative self-image. So you got two of those. Here she is being being the mother and the one who will always be with us as leader. And on the other hand, you've got her seeing herself as a sinner. And so you think, okay, which one was she? Well, happily, she was both. Because I think the greatest gift, greatest grace that we can receive is knowing ourselves as loved sinners. Because I've heard this so often. If I see myself only as loved, then I'm going to be really surprised and disheartened when I find out there's a lot of unlovable stuff about myself. On the other hand, if I only see myself as a sinner, I'll grovel in the dirt all my life. I mean, that's pretty bad. Sometimes I look at politicians and I say to myself, who do they think they are? Really, I don't mean it in that, who do you think you are? I don't mean in that tone of voice, but who do they think they are? And who do they think God is? That's it really, but that could lead me to be very judgmental. But I say to Angela, did you know yourself just as a saint, as a holy foundress? Or did you see yourself just as a wretched sinner? Or did you know yourself as both? Peter's a great example. One of the stories that I like to read about Peter was the first time he hadn't been following Jesus very long. And of course, he was a fisherman. And the guys had been working all night and they didn't catch anything. So he says to them, put your net, go out and cast your net on the other side. And like, okay, who's this guy? Who's he think he know about fishing? He was a carpenter, for heaven's sakes. But they didn't want to mess with the boss, So they did what he said, and they caught so many fish. They had to get their buddies to come help them before their boat sank. I always find it surprises me every time I read that story, because Peter's first response is, "Go away from me. I'm a sinful man." I mean, I'm not sure if that's how would have been my response, but that's how he responded. And Jesus did not say to him, "No, Peter, you're not a sinner." He said, "Follow me." Well, that kind of puts it all together. So I can follow Jesus. I can become a lover of God, whether I'm a sinner or not. In fact, the brighter light that shines on me, the darker the shadow comes. But both of those are me, the darkness and the light. Jesus says that to Peter more than once. You remember after the resurrection, Peter was repentant, of course, because he had denied Jesus. And Jesus kind of rubs his nose in it, asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter is beside himself. "Yes, Lord, you know all things. You know I love you." Each time Jesus tells him to go into a ministry, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. In other words, follow me. And that's the important thing, I guess, that puts those two things together. So Angela, in her coming to the reality of realizing that she also was a sinner, we can't point to any particular sins. Maybe she was proud. If she was, it doesn't express itself. But she knew herself as a sinner, and that was important. But she also knew herself as loved, not in spite of her sins, maybe because of them. Who knows? So she knew that about herself, that she was loved and a sinner, and a loved and a sinner, all of that. Now, you might ask yourself, who do you think you are? Do you know yourself as a loved sinner? I don't know if you do or not, but you could ask yourself about that. And if you really cannot say that deep in your gut you know yourself as loved and sinner, pray for that grace, because that's like the basis of a whole lot of other things. It's the basis of my relationship with God. It certainly is the basis for my relationship with other people. Because as I face other people, as Angela did, I cannot judge them. I can't, if I know myself as a sinner. So in a way, sinners make the best lovers, because it's like, I already know I'm a sinner, but I also know I'm loved, so I could be a lover too. That's wonderful. I guess that's also humility, the truest kind of humility. Not that beats on myself and says, I'm a sinner, I'm a sinner, I'm a sinner, because there's this echo in my ear always, follow me, follow me, follow me. Feed my lambs, feed my sheep. You're a sinner? Feed my lambs, feed my sheep. So it does not, my sinfulness, all the great saints tell us this, my sinfulness does not keep me from God or God from me. Most of the time it's the path that God uses to come to me and that I use in reaching to God, because I know who I am as I go before God. And then, of course, that alters my vision of who God is, because God would have to be very, very big to love me as if I'm a sinner. And then say, I don't have to worry about loving because God loves me. Isn't that simple? It's all about love. Loving, being loved, and being able to love. And the more I know myself as loved, the more I'm able to love. Then that opens up my relationship to other people. One time,
Sometimes it's something like a song that says, "Love, sweet love, that's all the world
what
is
the
in
world
need of,"
needs
or
now,
something.
yeah.
Yeah.
What the world needs now is love, sweet love.
Yeah.
That's the truth. Yes. Well, so we need to look at that and ask for that grace, and that grace gets deepened. The more we come to know our weaknesses and sinfulness, and the more we're open to being loved by God. And then what that does is open us up to love other people. I look at a lot of people, and I guess it's judgmental, but what I think is they have never been loved. They've never known some flesh person to love me. And when many years ago, when my sister used to, do, I don't know what, charitable works, whatever you want to call that, and she used to visit a home for children. And one time she went into a room, and most of the little children were playing and whatever, and there was one little boy who was in his crib. I don't know how old he really was. She thought he was like a year or two because he was very tiny and he didn't respond to anybody. And so my sister said to the nurse, "What's wrong with the little boy? How old is he?" And the woman said, "He's 8. And she said, "Well, what's wrong with him?" And she said, "When we first found him, he was tied in his crib." That child grew up crippled from the very beginning, not knowing love or a mother's love or a father's care. He grew up with nothing, and that's all he had. I mean, that is heartbreaking. So, how
You
could
say
that?
that about animals too.
Yes, I know.
If you don't love them and care for them and domesticate them, then they
die. That's what they do.
die, but they also get mean.
Yes.
So they have to be socialized otherwise.
Yes, don't we all?
Yeah. Really.
I look at some folks in our society, I think, what you need is a lover who loves you in spite of yourself. That would change you. So Angela had that gift of loving others. And she had that particular gift. She talks about having your daughters, each one, engraved on your heart. Each one. Because she says, that's how true love acts. There was a lady who used to call when I was in Pittsburgh. She'd call and say, "Would you pray for this or this? And don't lump me." Because we don't like to be lumped. All people who
Special intentions.
Yes, don't lump me. So Angela did not lump her daughters. She knew each one in particular. And she talks about that in one of the chapters. We're more or less like formation directors. And she says to them, know your daughters so well that there are some who need encouragement. And so give them a special encouragement to help them along. And some, she says, are forward. That's an interesting word. I don't know that we use that word anymore. Smart mouth, maybe, or stubborn, or whatever. And she said, give them sternness. Treat them with call them to, this is the way you go. So she knew how to love, not lumping her daughters, but each one individually. That is hard to do, especially as the numbers of the company grew. She started out with 28 who were actually members of the company. Well, 28 you can know. But then there were the colonelli, who were the novice directors, if you want to say that, formation directors. Then there were their other ladies who were, I would have found them harder to love, but they were very important because they had more of a legal presence. And then there were the men, and they certainly they needed the men so they could make their way, the company could make its way. So, but she loved them, each one in particular. We've talked about how she loved Antonio Romano and Agostino Gallo. She was like part of their family. So there was that closeness. But I suspect she did not love Agostino Gallo the way she loved Antonio Romano. Not one more than the other, but different, because they were different people. So I can look at my relationships with people and say, how do I love them without judging? I mean, come on, some people you like more because they're more likable. And some people, you don't like so much. But that does not mean that there's not love there. Love that takes the form of care and concern and prayer and help, if the person is helpable, to come to love. I've told this story many times about Sister George Marie. When she turned 100, she said to me, "Martha, it's all about love." And I said, "Oh, that's nice. Yeah, it's all about love." Next year, when she turned 101, she said, "Dear, I don't remember your name, but it's all about love." So I've known for a long time that it's all about love. But I have to say, when I look at the world now, it's really all about love. That is so simple, but we don't. And part of that is that we don't love ourselves, and part of it is that we don't know God is love. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to make any progress? Well, we're going to be lovers because it's all about love. And if we really believe that, it makes life really simple. Like, what is the most loving thing I could do for anybody? I don't do that. Once in a while I do. But it's like, that's the goal, and that's the desire, is to love all. Not equally, all individually. I don't lump them. Most people don't lump very well because people are really different. But if my attitude toward them is one of love, I'll find something that's lovable. I remember Sister Vera told us, she used to be our supervising teacher, I guess you'd call her. And she used to tell us that for every child she ever met, she always looked for something that she really liked about the child. And she said there was this one little boy who was in our classroom, and she could not find anything to love about the kid. So she tried and tried and tried. Finally, she said, his shoes are always polished. So she said, I started with that. Because find something that you love about the person and let it grow from there. Okay, now we've talked about 3 parts of spirituality. Angela stands toward herself, toward God, and towards others. That's her spirituality. Now, if we know those 3 things, 3 movements or stances in ourselves, that's our spirituality. Now, it's neither good, bad, nor indifferent. It just is. And the freedom comes if you don't like one or the other, change it as far as you can do that. Now, the other one, Angela never talks about creation. And I don't know if it's because it was so in her face, as it were, because she lived close to the earth, and she certainly lived among all kinds of people, good ones and bad ones and rich ones and poor ones, all nationalities, because she traveled so much. So we don't know how she related, to the earth. she talks about the beauty of flowers. She talks about that a couple of times. And you know, when I visited her place in the world, it's beautiful. You look around and you say, Angela never saw this house. She never saw this road. She didn't know anything about how those farmers are working the field. But all you have to do is look up and the Dolomites are there. She saw those mountains. They've been there since God threw them up, you know. So there's something about the place where you are that affects you. I remember visiting Cumberland many years ago, and I don't know who the sister was. She was from a different community, but she taught art. And she said she found the children so much more sensitive to beauty. And she said, I think it's because it's such a beautiful place. They're in the middle of mountains too, and there are fruitful fields and trees and all that, but it's beautiful. It really is a beautiful place. She said, I think that has affected their perception of nature. So that's important to reflect about. How do I love creation? I just got back from a trip to Canada, and I saw the Canadian Rockies. I was overwhelmed. But one of the things that I also noticed was that the Canadians are a whole lot more respectful of nature than we are from the United States. I didn't see any plastic the whole time I was there. Cloth napkins. We went to a McDonald's, and darn if they didn't serve a frappe in a glass dish with a metal spoon that you didn't throw away. They had paper napkins. It was amazing. I was truly impressed with the respect that they have for creation, the respect they have for their wildlife. I didn't, you know, they dug tunnels under the roads so the animals would go under the road and not go across the road and get killed. And then they built overpasses. And the newspapers laughed at them. They said, no creature's going to use that. Well, so they put cameras up. First one they got was a beaver, so he didn't count too much. They really laughed about that one. But now, all the animals use it. They have pictures of bears and elk, rabbits. I don't know. I never saw a rabbit while I was there. Lots of squirrels, but all kinds of animals go across there. So that says to me, they really went to a lot of trouble and expense to take care of the wildlife. So, you know, there is.
We're the only state that has a bridle path across to Expressway.
Where does?
We have a bridle path across 64. It's the only state in the Union that I know of that has a bridle path. Oh yeah, they didn't want to change the route of the bridle path in Cherokee Park.
So they built an overpass?
An overpass on 64.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They always refer to that as a tunnel. Is that it?
No, it's
The bridle path is the overpass.
Is an actual
overpass.
overpass
Out of the park to the other side of the park.
across the park.
Well, now that gives me something to be pleased with.
Yeah.
So we are attentive to our.
Well, at least that creature. I don't know how many other creatures use it, but people who ride in the park use it.
Okay, so it kind of reshapes our whole way of looking at creation, and we pray that that gets deepened while we still have a beautiful creation, that we shepherd it, tend it. I saw a movie, I think it was just called The Birds. I don't know if that was the name of it, but it was about flying birds, not, well, all birds fly, but this talked about wild birds, and it was remarkable. I don't know what kind of airplane or something that they had that could fly along with the flock, and it was taking pictures of these birds birds, big birds, right up close, like you could see their faces. It was like, and they went all these different places. And they showed wild birds in cities. And in one place, it was, I almost cried out loud. It showed these beautiful mallards stuck in the oil sludge. They were going to die. They were stuck. They couldn't get out. And of course, overhead was the belching towers of smoke and what have you. That really impressed me because it showed me the danger that we are to creation. So, what's our stance? Most of us, I shouldn't say that, many of us don't care. So, leave the electricity on all night so that you get a leak in your faucet, let it leak. Or, I don't care if I throw junk around, trash around, doesn't matter. To me, somebody will pick it up. So it's something about that respect for creation that is very precious and is akin to how I treat other people and what I think of myself, you know? And then, how do I see God in relationship to that? If I really believe that God made creation, then it's a handmaid of God as much as I am. And that's very sobering. God made that first. And I just got maybe added as an afterthought. That's not true. But creation was not made for my pleasure to do with it as I please. Although we really do have that, some of us really have that attitude, that it's for me to use. I always think the next generation, children, will be our salvation along there, because so many children have a much better stance toward taking care of the earth. And that's a good thing, because we hope they have it, that we're not going to do something to it to make it unlivable. Okay, so there's Angela's spirituality. How she was toward God, how she was toward herself, towards other people, toward creation. Now, I don't have to have the same spirituality she had, but I need to be aware, that's the big word, aware, conscious of my own spirituality. Otherwise, I kind of go through life, just plodding along, not paying attention to anything. Jesus talked a lot about loving your neighbor, but he also talked a lot about paying attention. I think he talked about that more than telling you to love your neighbor. He said, pay attention. What's going on? He said to his disciples, this always hurts me. Have I been with you such a long time and you don't know who I am? That's really sad, that I could have been with a loving, faithful community and I still haven't got it. Or I can have this wonderful human body that I have and I'm still not aware of its relationship with all the rest of the human bodies. So that's kind of what I wanted to tell you today. There's more about her spirituality that we will talk about, and that includes her ministry and discernment, which is really very, very important, but we'll leave that for another time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Martha.
How do you do again? Today we're going to talk about Angela and ministry and Angela and discernment. And today we have the joy of two Amy's, Amy Olson and Amy Knoll. And we're going to have at it. So if I say Amy, they can decide which one I'm talking to.
Sounds like a plan.
Yes. Okay. First, I want to talk about Angela and Ministry. I reread the chapter, and I was really pleased that I could focus again on something that I think is very important in ministry, because I'm around a lot of ministers of various kinds. And a refrain that goes through everything they say is, "I'm so busy." And it's like, get over it. Angela says about ministry, I think it is so interesting that she said that. This charge ought not to be a burden laid on you. And I talked to a number of deacons, and if anybody tells me how busy they are, it's deacons. And I said to the one gentleman what Angela had said, this charge ought not to be a burden to you. And then I realized that comment from her comes out of all the other things we've talked about, out of her spirituality. First of all, who she thought God was, and who she thought she was. She thought of herself as beloved by God, and she called God my lover of us all, which includes, all of us. And so, if love puts a charge on us, it isn't burdensome. I think that all parents should be canonized. I don't know if we've ever told you this or not, because what love does is focuses you on the other. And I don't know any parents who are self-centered. You can't be. You don't have time to be self-centered when all of your attention is on this little one whom you love. I mean, that's love. And so that isn't a burden, I guess, to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and feed the baby or change pants 20 times a day, because it comes out of love. That's so important for all of us to remember, like, why am I doing this? Which talks about ministry. Angela never uses the word ministry because it was not a word in vogue in her time. She talked about service, serving others, and that's what ministry is. But it also comes out of her spirituality. Knowing God is the one who loved her, and knowing herself as both loved and sinner, does something about who she thinks other people are. They're worthy, they're lovable, and she wants to, we'd say minister, she would say serve, I think, the others, because it comes out of love, which keeps it from being a burden laid upon you. You're shaking your head. You know what I mean. Yes. You both have children, and you're both teachers, or you deal with teachers. And I've heard you all talk so much about the joy of being with your students and how you like them, which is in Angela's words. She wants us to know one another and love one another out of a place in our heart that is particular to each one. I think that's hard to do when you're dealing with the whole school, or the whole school plus their parents and outsiders as well. I mean, it's hard to do, but I think people do that. Each one who comes in is different, so you don't say to the one what you say to the next one, whether they be teacher or parent or student, because each one is different. And we have them engraved in our hearts, one by one, which is the ultimate, I think, of service. But you also see how it comes out of Angela's spirituality. She was one who loved others and who knew she was loved, and who was sensitive to the environment, though she never, ever says that. That was not a word in their vocabulary at that time. But being a farm girl, she knew about taking care of plants, hoping that the sun shone at the right time and the water came at the right time. So while she never spoke of the environment, she dealt with it lovingly.
And do you think that's why people were drawn to her?
Absolutely.
They sensed that when they were around her.
Yes. Would you approach somebody who is mean and grouchy with people and dismiss them? Hardly. I mean, we are attracted to people who are loving,
Yes.
even if they're loving in their own style. We've talked so much about, who comes from a German background and who comes from an Italian one, or how affection is shown. Well, those are all different styles of hospitality, but whether or not you are effusively welcomed or whether or not you're politely welcomed, you still know that the person is lovable and loving, and so it's not a burden to be with them. In fact, I remember way long ago when I used to be a teacher, somehow the students who gave me the most grief, behavior-wise and learning-wise, somehow became special, and I seemed somehow to love them more. They needed more, I think. Yes, one of our sisters who was a supervising teacher would say to us, always find something good about every child. And she told us about one little boy. She really had a hard time. She said, I looked and looked and listened. I could not find anything good about the little kid. She said, I really had a hard time loving him. And then I noticed that every day his shoes were shined. So I always focused on that. I loved him especially because his shoes were shined. That only lasts for so long until a deeper kind of love happens. But for her, that was the beginning, to find something about each child that she loved and could help her to love the child more. Anyway, so out of that, ministry is about loving, and outpouring. We talk about Angela's charism of that contemplative love for God with an openness and eagerness to serve the needs of others. And that's all about ministry. That's what that is. Okay, so from there I want to transition to what I think is one of the most important things that any person has ever taught other people, and that is discernment. I'm not sure she ever used that word. It's more than about making a decision. If I want a new job, or if I should wear this red dress or this blue dress, it's not about those kinds of choices. It's a way of life. So if the discernment is coming out of a loving heart, then that's going to be where the weight is. Like, where am I most loving? To whom am I attracted? And what kind of ministry attracts me where it touches into my loving heart? The basis for this is Angela's chapter in her rule on obedience, because discernment is connected to obedience. And she said something that was just not acceptable in her day, especially by the hierarchy, because she says, first of all, she says, obey God, obey the church, obey the Pope and the bishops and your parents. And then she kind of names all that. And then she says, but above all, I always think that should have stars by it, because whenever she uses that, when she talks about almost everything, but above all, she says, pay attention to that one, because this is where it's really at. So she says, but above all, obey the inspirations of the Holy Spirit, which will be constantly heard in your heart. Now that's dangerous because, that you might be inspired to do something that would not be a good thing.
Or the norm of the time.
Yes. But see, she always adds a caveat. She says, obey your conscience, which is made more pure, always. Always to hold your conscience, your approach to life, I guess. Let it be purified. That's hard. How will I let my conscience be purified? Well, I find a test for that in politics because I want to judge politicians, leaders, harshly if I don't like them. But if I let my heart be purified, I may find an opening to love those people as my conscience gets purified, made more holy. Holy as in whole. Because if my heart is really whole, it has lots of room. And then it can love more kinds of people. So I let that happen. I don't know if I let it happen. It happens. Life will do that to you. Think of yourselves now. You started out and your baby was the most beautiful, the most precious child there ever was. Don't tell me any different. And when you get to be grandmothers, I think that gets worse or better, however you look at it. But if you only held your baby and didn't let it go and grow and go out of the house and make its own friends, you're killing the child instead of loving it. So love has this way of spreading out. And see, that changes us. It really does. You think of yourself, all the things that you have changed in your life about what you accept and whom you accept. I always think about homosexuality when we get to it. That's one of those sticking points for a lot of people. And I always think, may you be blessed by a gay son or lesbian daughter. Then you'll find out. You'll find out what happens when love comes into that situation. Changes the whole thing. I've seen it happen in my own family, for one place, but all of a sudden it breaks that open. If my son has always been lovable, and he's gay besides, he's still lovable because he's my son and I've always loved him, and so I'll just love him being gay. And if I love him being gay, look out, because that opens the door for the sons of everybody else who also are gay and lovable. So that kind of purification happens to us as we live our lives, especially as we live our lives in faith. Because Jesus did not put stipulations. I'm not going to love that group. He would have got rid of the Pharisees right away and some of the other hangers-on, but he didn't do that. He left that open because his conscience was certainly purified and well developed. So the first thing about discernment is to allow our hearts to be purified. Now, many saints have given us methods of discernment. I think especially of Saint Ignatius. I don't know if it's because he was a man, but he gave rules for discernment. You do it this way. If this happens, then you do it this way. He had it all laid out, which is wonderful. Much too complicated for a lot of people. Angela didn't do that. So if you search through her writings, as I've really tried to do that to see, does she give any hints about decision making? Well, she says, consult the company. That's the first thing that I think about. Ask other people. Because if you are just asking yourself, some wise person said, if you're only consulting with yourself, you're consulting with a fool. So to broaden that sense of who are the wise people that you know, you consult with them. I tried that once. Actually, I tried it many times. In my heart, I had wanted to open a place to pray in the city, because that's, really what Angela did. She loved the world. She didn't renounce it. She stayed with it. So I said, I'd really like to open a house of prayer in the city. So the people I would consult were the people I was living with. And glory be to God, they were all the novices, because I was novice director at the time. So I brought it up. And the one young woman looked at me and she said, that's really dumb. She said, you can't possibly do that. You'd never make it. Well, that was a challenge in some ways.
Yeah.
But it also gave me pause to, pare down some of my great aspirations. But it was in my heart to do this, so I did it in a different way from the way I had started. And I did that for 10 years. And it made an impression on the neighborhood, though the neighbors never came, but they knew we were there. And they always greeted me like they knew what was going on in that house, and they respected that. So I don't care what the novices said. It made an impression on people. So consult the company. Maybe it's your spouse. Maybe it's your children, because they have a different view of the world than you have, whether you like that or not. But, okay, so she says to do that, consult the company. First thing, really, is pray. And she says, pray earnestly. I don't know what that means exactly. Pray earnestly. Aren't all prayers earnest? But I guess some of them are more earnest than others, with some kind of a passion to it. So she says, pray earnestly. And then she says something that people really have a hard time doing. It's like, try it out. And if it doesn't work, adjust it. Because she doesn't say that's a dumb thing, you shouldn't have even started it. It's rather, no, adjust it. Don't give up that big, deep desire that's in your heart to do something. You have to adjust it to reality. So those are about all that she said about what you could call discernment. I like what she says, if it turns out badly, don't repeat it. That's, she doesn't say you should never make a mistake.
Right.
Because most of us, the hardest thing to get off the human tongue is, I made a mistake. It won't come off.
That's true.
If you notice, certain people always want to blame somebody else.
Yes.
The devil made me do it. It's like, I didn't do that. Something else made me do that. But to say openly, I really made a mistake. That was the wrong thing to have done. That's a wonderful gift, because how will we ever learn to go in a better way? When a child falls down, they get back up, and they don't say, my shoes were too slippery, or whatever. They get up. They make a change in their behavior, but they don't blame anybody. They just say, I didn't do that, or I couldn't do that. Go jump 10 feet. That's a great idea, but I can't do that. And if I did, that would be a mistake. And I'd have to say, I should not have done that. So her rules for discernment are really kind of easy. Pray earnestly, which means you really must want it. And you always pay attention to what you really want. And then consult the company Don't go it alone. And learn from your mistakes, and don't be afraid to say, I made a mistake. Right now, I'm reading the lives. This is my going project right now. I'm reading the lives of all the presidents. And it is very interesting because some of the presidents would not learn from their mistakes, and some of them really did. This was the wrong maneuver. I think George Washington did that, probably with more grace. He was a wonderful person to be with his troops, but some of his battles were really dumb. And afterwards, he realized that and didn't repeat that. So I think he was a great man because, among other things, he learned from mistakes. Anyway, so pray earnestly, consult the company, and maybe that's an evaluation. Evaluate your choices. And if they're not good ones, then say, I made a mistake, and do something differently.
Do you think when you say the pray earnestly, is that your connection into that conscience when you talk about following your own conscience is if God is the voice of our conscience, is the pray earnestly the first, like consult yourself, consult your conscience, then measure that with the input from those you trust.
Yes.
And weigh all of that. I mean, sometimes I wonder, can that be, what do you do when there's a discrepancy? So you pray earnestly and you have this, in your conscience, you feel this is what you should do. How do you balance that when maybe those you trust or those you love the most might see it differently, or maybe you think you're following your conscience and you're really following something else.
Yes.
So how do you balance all of that, or how do you determine which is what? Does that make sense?
Yes, very much so. And Saint Angela says, pay attention to the way it turns out. That's how, if it doesn't turn out right, well, then that was, you don't repeat that. You learn from that. I think Washington did that.
Yeah. So you have to go full circle. So you have to be willing to make the mistakes.
You're right.
Which is tough, right? Don't you think that's tough? You just said it's hard to have that off our tongue. So, but it sounds like you have to go this full circle and take that risk, and be willing to make the mistake.
Yes, exactly.
Again.
And you can do that as long as you remember who God is and who you are. Then it's okay. It's okay to make a mistake because it's safe to do that.
And I was wondering with the pray earnestly, if it's really praying to God about what you think you want to do, but not forcing that prayer like I need X, Y, and Z, but really turning it over to Him. If that's the praying earnestly piece, like I trust you enough.
Yes.
This is what I'm thinking. However,
Instead of a prayer, give me this,
Yes.
give me this, give me this. Because I think that's one of the challenges of a prayerful life is what that looks like. Because in some ways it can look like a list of, I need you to give me this, 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 and this. But is it really the earnestness of it, the idea of keep me open to all the possibilities or to what may be? That's tough.
It's very tough.
maybe not demanding in our prayers,
Yes.
but more.
Yeah.
But again, that comes out of
Yeah.
who God is and who you think you are. If I think that God is loving and forgiving, then it's more about relationship than it is things.
Right.
I don't know if I told you this story about a gentleman who came to me one time because his wife said that if you don't get spiritual direction, I'm going to leave you. What what a burden for him.
Oh, wow.
So I always ask people, what do you want? What do you really want? And he squirmed around and he said, well, I want a raise. And he said, I guess I can't ask for that. I said, I don't know why you can't ask for that. So as weeks, months went on, we talked about all kinds of things. One time he came in and he said, you won't believe what happened. He said, my daughter, who never, ever, ever does this, called me and asked me if I would come over and help her and her husband to build a bookcase. He said, never has she ever asked me to do something like that. He said, I went over, helped them with a bookcase, and we had a few beers together, and we just sat and talked. And then it dawned on me, and I think on him, that what he really wanted was a relationship with his children, because they had all left home right away. And he wanted a raise so that he could keep his youngest daughter at home, because he could send her to college and she could stay at home. When that dawned on me, and I think on him, it changed the whole equation. His desire, under the other desire, was for relationship, a loving relationship with his children. That's why knowing what your desire is so important. So if you have a Christmas wish list when you pray, then think about, where does that come from? What's that for? Because underneath the desire for the big Christmas list is another more important desire. And that brings me to, we've talked about this before, I think. You can call it all kinds of things, but you can call it, St. Ignatius calls it an examen of consciousness, not conscience, but consciousness. Like, where have your awarenesses been? Like, what are you aware of? And where do desires come out of that awareness? There's a story about Moses. You probably saw the Ten Commandments 20 times, where Moses receives the Ten Commandments, and he had told the people about what they should do and not do. And he goes up to the mountain, and God gives him the Ten Commandments. And he comes down, and the people are worshiping a golden idol. A golden calf. So he's furious, and he throws the tablets down and throws the calf off the altar and beats it up and screams at the people, and he pouts up to the top of the mountain. And he said to God, why did this happen? How did you let this happen? Talk to me. He said, talk to me like man to man. Show me your face. And God said to him, gently and lovingly, I'd have said, you dummy, but God didn't. He said, Moses, you cannot see my face and live, but I'll show you what I'll do. He said, I will hide you in that cave over there and put my hand in front of you to protect you, and then I will go past you, and you will see my glory coming after me. I will trail my glory past you. Now, that is a wonderful invitation to all of us to pay attention to our lives. One good question to ask yourself every day is, where did God trail his glory in my life today? Now, what that does, if you keep on doing that, it's like that's part of the conscience purification. Right now, out of that window is a good sign of God's glory. Mm-hmm. Not only have we had a lot of rain, though we need some right now, but the trees have responded. They seem so much fuller than usual. It is so beautiful just to drive through the park or driving through your own neighborhood. It's like, there's God's beauty, there's God's love, there's God's fidelity. And so that's how God trails his glory past us in so many ways. You know, there are people that you meet every day, and you get so used to how good they are that you don't pay attention to it. But I look at you all, I don't know you deeply, but what I see of you is a concern for other people, an energy to do that, and a joy. And if that isn't part of God's glory, I don't know what is. So the goodness of other people certainly trail God's glory. And if I start looking for that, that alters my way of looking at people. And when it comes to making decisions or discerning a choice or whatever, that alters that. And see, that's part of what Angela says. Obey the Holy Spirit, constantly speaking in your heart. And so you have to pay attention, because you know how it is to have somebody talk, and you don't even know what they're saying.
Right.
Because it bombards you, and you can't pay attention. And to think that God is constantly in our heart means we really have to pay attention. And what we're looking for, we will find.
And that kind of wraps back to what you started with about the busyness.
Yes.
And the burden of ministry and that busyness of it. Because if you're really paying attention, it's in the busyness that we don't pay attention.
Exactly.
And so when you say that, I'm taken back to the beginning of our discussion, and it seems quite simple, but it's not something I really think of. Sometimes the truth is so simple.
Most of the time it is.
And so when you think that in the busyness, we think, in our modern world, we're always multitasking. I can multitask. I can do all of these things. But what we lose is that paying attention, that trail of glory, that really just even taking the time to stop and look at out the window and see the beauty, or walk through this campus, walk through the park and see that beauty. But all of those ways, that's there's so much truth there, and it seems so simple, but not always easy.
That's right.
And I think society and our daily life really encourage you to be busy. There's
Yes.
a sense of glory in daily life if you're really busy. You're earning your keep. And I think sometimes we busy ourselves.
And also there's a self-promotion.
We lose that. Yeah, self-promotion, absolutely.
Yeah. Yesterday we saw Aladdin.
Oh,
I don't know if you've seen the movie.
the actual movie.
Uh-huh.
I haven't seen it, but I've heard about it.
It's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
Like all those Disney stories is good versus bad.
Yes.
It's always that. That's what all great literature is. That.
Right.
But this is really played out vividly. I mean, you can't miss the good, the bad. But there is such reflection possible. Like what was under all of this? What was going on? The struggle between good and evil. If you pay attention to that, your conscience gets purified. Because nobody would like to be like that evil prince who had a tattletale parrot that told him everything. We don't want to be like that. We'd rather be a thief, like Aladdin was, because he was at heart very generous to people. So it's like, take a look at that. And yes, that movie was busy. There's so much dancing and so much color and so many explosions. You kind of get overwhelmed. It's like, I got to step back from this and figure out what's really going on. Anyway, so yeah, we have to step back from our lives once in a while, every day, and say, as you go to sleep, where was God trailing his glory in my day today? Or once in a while, where has God trailed his glory in my life? all the choices that have brought me to where I am, that all enhances my ability to discern. It's much more than, am I going to wear this blue dress or whatever. It has to do with what is bringing me life. It's all about life. It's all about love. Where is this? And every day counts. Every day, every day. It's wonderful. You breathe every day. So we can do this every day. Anyway, so we have talked about ministry, which comes out of our spirituality, which leads us into a discussion or reflection on discernment and the great gift that we have of being able to discern what our true desires are. Get under the Christmas list, or pay attention to the Christmas list and get under it. What is it that you're really wanting? So, is there anything else you want to say?
Let's see. I'll write that down. I like that you talk about the desires of that Christmas list. So that's another form of that discernment or that contemplation, is looking at what desire, and I like your example with the gentleman, that in learning that here's the list, here's that more tangible something that I want, God give me this. But when you spend that time really contemplating what's the desire underneath that, and I think that's very helpful.
It's also very rewarding. You know, it's God's love calling us to see with His eyes and purify our lives so that we can discern more quickly. And if we're used to doing that day by day by day, it gets easier.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think the next time, I don't know what we're going to talk about. We'll find out when we do it. Here we are to talk about the last chapter in the book, Angela, a woman of hope, and dialogue with her times. And you know, that's really a very important topic for right now, because here we are, women in dialogue with our times, and hopefully as women of hope. When I talked to Angela about this, you know, I've really talked to her a lot. And sometimes she talks back to me, but not always. But when I try to read her comments, as it were, in her writings, and I don't know if you'll have this book or not, but all of her writings are in this book. And so I went through the book countless times, trying to see what is she about and what is she talking about and what are her values. What was she saying to the people who were following her? First of all, to set her in her own times, they are very similar to ours. They were similar to ours. The church was in crisis. I mean, things look bad now, but if we made it through that period without the church falling apart, we can make it through anything. And we're just being formed. Italy was not a nation. It was a group of city-states. You were either Milanese or Venetian or whatever province. They're provinces now, but whatever they were called at the time. And they did not get along very well. So there were always fights going on. Political, but also violence. A lot of people were killed. And then on top of that, they kept talking about the French coming in or the Spanish. So they either had the French disease or the Spanish disease, all of which were, of course, venereal diseases, and the people did not know how to take care of them. So a lot of people died unnecessarily. So there were a lot of sick people, And there was also the same division in society as today. I mean, they were very, very wealthy people. Sometimes today when I see television and I see somebody's house and it goes on for acres, and I think, glory be to God, why are they living in such a huge place? But it goes on today, and it certainly went on in Angela's time. There was a society division, like if you were part of the aristocracy, you had everything you could possibly want. And if you were not, you had hardly anything. There was not really a middle class to speak of, although there were, craftsmen and laborers and builders, what have you. But by and large, you were either very wealthy or very poor. And for the most part, I think, even the very wealthy were pretty uneducated. Many people did not read. And amazingly, Angela learned how to read as a child. Now, this is after the invention of the printing press, but people did not ordinarily have libraries in their homes. But Angela's family did. Her father had the Bible, and he had the Lives of the Saints. So that's what she grew up on. He read to the family, and obviously she learned to read from him. So, in many ways, it's kind of like things are today. There are many, many people, as you know, who don't know how to read. It amazes me when I read about people who can't read and can't even sign their names. They can't write. So that's a similarity also. So then I say to Angela, okay, how'd you deal with that? What did you do? And so I look at her life to see what she did. She grew up in a loving atmosphere in a family that was very strong. Her mother and father. She had an older brother and an older sister and a young brother. She only had one sister. And they lived, it's interesting, in the little town of Desenzano, where we know she was born, there's I'd call it an apartment complex, but I don't know what they called it. Anyway, they were apartments, and the family lived, there's a marker on the wall outside that says, tradition says she was born in such and such apartment. There's a number there. But we don't know if she really lived there or not. I like to give it the benefit of the doubt. So that's where she started. But somewhere along the line, their father moved them to a rural area. It's called La Grezza. It isn't really a town. It's like a gathering of farmhouses. They're not even all close together. And the place that we, as Ursans, kind of claim as her space is a fairly large, I don't know what to call it. To grace it with a term, apartment complex would be, a great exaggeration, because the area that was thought to be their home was one room on the first floor and one room on the second floor. And as I got to know the area, the other places along there are like that too. There's just ground floor and an upper floor. At one time, one area was the chapel or the church of Saint Angela Merici, after she was dead long ago. But this one little area, because that's the first place we met for Mass. Later, they have built a very large, beautiful church, the only new church I ever saw while I was there. And now that, I don't know what they're doing with that area now. Anyway, so she grew up in this little house. I'd like to call it a house. And on the first floor was a fireplace, large fireplace, and a well, which always surprised me that it was inside. So they had running water and they had heat. And because the room was so small, I guess it didn't take a lot to heat it, but the floor was dirt, not carpeted or anything like that. It was just a dirt floor. On the second floor was one room, and that was the bedroom. And a mat is on the floor. People make such a big deal about that. You know, oh, she slept on a mat. Well, everybody did. So it wasn't at least everybody in that financial area space. So that's where she grew up, and her father had a farm, and the farms were about as extensive as a square block. So we're talking small. And I don't know what he grew. Probably wheat. I don't know, some other grain that they used. And he had a vineyard, but the vineyards were all together, and each farmer had a section that was his part of the vineyard. And there was a sidewalk all around it. So that's where she grew up. In the town of Desenzano, there's a church, and I can't remember the name of it. It's very nice, but it's very old. And the only thing that people claim was there when she was there was the baptismal font. And we don't know if that's the truth or not, but we like that. We have a picture of it in our house. So she grew up there, was educated by her parents. Her father's name was John. We don't know what her mother's name was, and we don't know the names of her brothers and her sister. Though she was very close to them, particularly to her sister. Now, as happened in those days, there was we call it a plague. I don't know what we would call it today, an epidemic, you know. And so I see on television that sometimes, you know, whole towns are wiped out when something goes through that people don't know the cure for. That's what happened in Angela's area. A lot of people died, including her sister, whom she loved dearly. Not at the same time, but around the same time. Both parents died and her older brother. So that left Angela and her younger brother. Now, you look at the stories on TV about what goes on at the southern border, and you see how people are dying uselessly because people don't have what they need to take care of themselves. So that's similar to our time. Also, the lack of understanding and trust when it comes to who's in charge, that restlessness and fear was there. So I asked Angela, what kept you from being afraid? How did you manage all of that? When your parents died, how did you manage that? She became the landowner because her brother was older and her sister, and they died. So she was, in a way, she was in charge of the farm. Well, there's all kinds of disagreement about how old she was when all this happened. But apparently, she thought it was a good thing. Her aunt and uncle, who lived in another town not too far away, she went to live with them. And I assume her little brother went with her, though no mention is ever made of him. So she lived with her aunt and uncle. Now, that happens today. Children are bereaved. And so we know what that looks like and what that feels like to be in a grief situation. So her aunt and uncle were very good to her. She was another person to help take care of things. They were not farmers. I don't know what their name was, Biancosi. I don't know what they did to make a living, but apparently they were quite wealthy. So she lived into a different situation. We've seen that happen too. Sometimes children are orphaned and they move to a place that's good for them. And so they learn more about the world than they had known before. Because Desenzano was a very tiny place. It still is, actually. So you don't get a lot of exposure to many things in a little place like that. But they moved to Selo, which is the name of the town where the Biancosis lived. It too was a lake town, but wealthier. And so she grew up in a society that she had not had before. And fortunately, yes, for all of us. She met the Franciscans. The Franciscans had a friary on an island just off of Silo. This is all Lake Garda, that's the biggest lake in Italy. When I saw it, I don't know if I was expecting to see one of the Great Lakes, because they kept saying it's the biggest one in Italy. Well, it's about maybe a third of the size of one of the Great Lakes. But it's very important because it extends up into Austria. And so you still have people who speak German and Italian and all that in that area, because there was a lake, it was a lot of merchants. They still do. So instead of, I don't know if they probably call them on the phone now, but instead, the ships went back and forth and they did their trading that way. That exposed her to something new. And you know what it feels like when you go into something new. That's a common experience. I don't know if you experienced that when you got a new job. I bet you did.
I did.
And you did too, I bet. It changes everything. You change one element and the whole thing shifts. So, but fortunately, she met the Franciscans and took to their spirituality like fish to water. She absorbed from them or learned from them simplicity and hope and joy. Those are all characteristics of the Franciscan charism. Simplicity and joy and hope. And those were already in her, but they nurtured it so that she became a person of great joy and great hope and an intelligence that was broad for a woman in her circumstances, because the Franciscans are missionaries. And so, in a way, she became that also. Now, I compare that, those are so many common experiences. It took me a long time to realize that she was a businesswoman, because part of being a landowner and leasing her land to other farmers when she went to live with her uncle and aunt, she had to go back and collect the rent. Which that's a different kind of category. I had a hard time, adjusting to that. I never thought of her as a businesswoman, but there are records, and so this is not made up. There are records in Desenzano about whoever was farming, that she came and collected their rent every year. So that's very exciting to me. Because, sometimes you're put in a situation where you would never do something, except something happens and you have to pick up something to do that you wouldn't ordinarily do. And I kind of think it must have been like that for her. Who would have thought, as she was a little kid running around in Desenzano, that she was going to be a businesswoman? So she was a savvy person. Okay, so we put all those together. She was smart. She knew how to read. She was a businesswoman, and she was a woman full of hope in a situation and at times that looked pretty hopeless. Well, so I look at us and I think we're in that same situation. We're living in a very dark period of history for our own country, but also for the world. We know a whole lot more about the rest of the world than Angela did, but we also know the intimacy of what goes on in our own families, what goes in our neighborhood. A young man has moved in next door to us from Guatemala. We don't know anything about him, and we're not going to find out whether or not he's illegal or illegal. Doesn't matter to us. He has moved in, and his fiancée is going to move in soon. That's wonderful. A new world is going to move in next door to us. The neighbors just moved out from there who were Muslim. That was an entirely different experience for us. We learned to recognize which children had on which jihad and who the ranking of the girls and the mother and father. It was like our world got enlarged there too, because I would never have thought I would be talking to a woman who was a teacher of the Quran. And so she said she would tell us things. She never got around to it before she left, but I always wanted to listen to her talk about Islam. So at Angela's time, the Christians were fighting the Islam people. Anyway, I keep trying to draw parallels because right now what our world needs is hope. You know, in a way, you can't love unless there's hope. Mm-hmm. And I know that faith is the basis of our lives, but hope is so important to faith. Mm-hmm. How could you have hope if you don't have faith? And how can you have faith if you don't have hope? Right. So the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, they go together. Yeah. And you can hardly take one out without disturbing the others. Yeah. So she was a woman of hope. Now, how do we know that? Because people flocked to her. Mm-hmm. You don't go to somebody, well, maybe you have to, who's doom and gloom all the time. Because that's painting a picture of reality that has not known Christ, has not known the risen Christ. But we have, as Christians, we know the risen Christ. Angela never talked about theological issues like the risen Christ. Mm-hmm. She doesn't ever use that title. She speaks of the Lord, of divine majesty, shepherd. She has various names for God, but they're all shot through with hope. Mm-hmm. And so people went to her because they needed hope, just like we need hope. Mm-hmm. That's why I think it's so exciting to be a woman today. Mm-hmm. For one thing, I think women are standing on the cusp of a whole new world. When I look at the women in Congress, it's like, this never happened before. Mm-hmm. So there's something moving. It's painful. Women keep bumping their heads on the glass ceiling, as we saw with the players last week who won the cup. The soccer team, yeah. Who don't get anywhere near the pay that men do. People are beginning to realize that and making a fuss about it. Yeah. Equal pay, we're learning to say, to women who have reached the top of their profession mm-hmm. more than once. 4 times they've done it. But it also happens like in other areas of living, like medicine. So many of our best doctors and scientists are women. Finally, it's like women have brains, for God's sake. You never would have known it. I taught girls for many years, mm-hmm. and I met some of the brightest people I've ever met. I taught boys for a while, too, but that was a different story. The ones who were smart were really smart, and smart aleck along with it. But the young women that I've met in my teaching career, some of them were just outstanding scholars who loved learning. Mm-hmm. And then you look at our community, how many graduates of our schools are top positions. They're judges, doctors. So something is happening that I think is really good. And I think Angela would fit in right away because the people she drew to her were women. Mm-hmm. And she had to have some men in there because some things couldn't be legalized unless the man was the lawyer or whatever. Mm-hmm. But they held a very remote responsibility in the company. Although they were all women, which is remarkable. She didn't have anybody. She wrote her own rule, which also is very unusual because for the most part, women congregations in the church today, their rules are written by men, which is really, isn't that interesting? Anyway, she wrote her own rule, and it was never suppressed, although when the company became an order, which was not done to them by the church. It was done by a woman in Paris who wanted to start a Carmel. And so she wanted them to have this position in the church that was important. So she gathered these women together. They objected to that. And they said, no, we have to have contact with the world because that's how Angela was. So they were allowed to bring girls into the monastery. But that's when we picked up the whole monastic baggage, that's the word. We became nuns, and we had to pray the divine office and wear a habit and the whole thing, go behind cloister walls. It took us a long time to come out of that. That came along with Vatican Council II. But who were the people who led that movement? Women. And so who taught most children? Women, even professors. We had sisters in the community who were doctors. They taught science. We had one sister who wrote books about scientific methods and another who wrote a history book. So it's like, women have been very much in the forefront in education in particular, but not necessarily. Do you know the first woman pharmacist in the United States was an Ursuline? People don't know that. There's this traveling display. I think it has found a permanent home now, but for a while they were taking it around the country to show, and there's her microscope. I just found that, chilling somehow to know that in the backwoods of New Orleans, had to have been way before the Civil War, probably before the War of 1812. There were Ursulines there, and one of them was a pharmacist. Remarkable. Anyway, so those were exciting times, and these are exciting times. And Angela was like one of those who helped to ignite it. She's sometimes recognized as that, and there are books written about the history of religious life, women, and she's always got a special chapter because she was different, the way she went about organizing her group. So she was in dialogue with her times, that's for sure. She knew what was going on in her world, and it was a lot larger than Desenzano. It was a lot larger than the city of Milan, because she had been to the Holy Land, and all those little other places around. She'd been to Venice. She'd been to Milan more than once. So there you go. She was a woman of the world, and so she was in dialogue with her times, and I think that's what we are now. Otherwise, why are you interested in her? That's how I want to conclude this whole discussion. I mean, we've been together for quite a while through these, not everybody at the same time, but you know a whole lot about her and about her history. Do you have an impression of her that you find life-giving or not life-giving?
Oh, certainly. I mean, I think that everything that you just talked about and that I see in the Ursuline sisters is that striving to make the world a better place and risking, taking a chance, being vulnerable to take those risks out in the world. And I know last week when we did our little meeting with the sisters, hearing all the places, all of the pathways. It wasn't one straight pathway. And I think that is inspiring about Angela too. That it's not one straight pathway. But that idea that we are called to go out into this world, that it can be a very scary place, and to bring it hope. And I think that is super inspiring, because that's what we try to do every day, I hope.
Yes, I think so too. That's one reason that I have such respect for associates, because you have a different kind of relationship to the world than the sisters do. And then Jenny is the director of the Angela Merici Center for Spirituality. So you get an entirely different, not different, broader contact with the world and the spirituality of Angela.
I mean, the thing that I think that draws me to Angela is how she was true to herself. That she had opportunities to go off and like the invitation. My understanding is the invitation from the Pope.
Yes.
To come to Rome and and do what she was doing in Brescia or Desenat.
Brescia, by that time.
Yeah, to do that in Rome, and she didn't say right to the Pope's face no. She skipped out in the middle of the night.
That's right.
She knew what was true for
That's
her.
right. That's right.
She knew what was right for her. I'm just wondering, Martha, if you could, I've wondered, with everything that's going on in the church today, and I hear and I know people who've just taken their ball and bat and gone elsewhere, who've been very disillusioned and very hurt, people who've been very wounded. What would Angela say? Do you have any sense of that, of what she would say about the church and how to be faithful?
That's a good question. Yes, I've thought about that. I've asked her about that. There's never been a reform that has lasted, that has not come from within. So I can leave my order, not at my age, but I could leave the church. But then how could I speak to it? And I think there are many people who, for other reasons, have left the church, and I don't dispute that. And if that's what they have come to understand and discerned that that's what they should do, they have to be true to that. But it's going to be very hard for them to reform the church, because it's okay to throw stones when you're outside of the glass house. But if you're within it, you don't throw stones, you remake it. And I see signs of that also happening. People keep talking. They may speak angrily or softly, but there's change that's happening, I think, in the church. The church moves very slowly. So it's happening very slowly. But you know that the Holy Father recently has appointed lay women as the head of some of the dicasteries. Wow, that's really different. That maybe people don't even grasp that, because there have always been clerics at the heads of those offices, dicasteries within the Curia. Now they're women. Some of them, God forbid, they're lay women. Probably they're married, I don't know what that makes. So there's that. Once it starts happening at that place in the church, then it will spread out, hopefully, that just like the young women in Congress are making a lot of waves. They couldn't have done that unless they were within the structure itself. So that's where I find hope there. I'll never live to see the end of that, but you probably won't either, right? It's not going to happen real soon. There's this joke about, wanting to see the Holy Father, and she'll have her husband with her. But that's way in the future. There's this little story I love to tell about Saint Martha, who, we always see that story between Martha and Mary. But there was another meeting Martha had with Jesus when her brother Lazarus had died. So she goes out first to see Jesus. She's the first one who goes out. I could just see her standing there shaking her finger at him. If you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And he didn't say anything. And she said, yes, he will rise again at the last day. And Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will never die. Do you believe that? What a question. Do you believe that? And she says, yes, Lord, I have come to believe that you are the Christ. Now I love that, because that's a progression. I have come to believe. It's not like I didn't jump on the bandwagon right away.
Right.
I have come to believe that you are the Christ. When Peter said that, Jesus made him the Pope. Practically the same words. I just chuckle about that. But Jesus says to Martha, where have you laid him? So they quickly changed the subject. But she says that's wonderful. I have come to believe that you are the Christ. It's kind of like, when have I come to believe that Jesus is Lord? When was that? And is that a process? I mean, we're always in that process of coming to know Jesus more deeply as the Lord, the risen Christ. Well, I think women are doing that too. And they're coming, it's coming from within. You know, I always think every parent should be canonized. A lot of people who aren't mothers don't or should be canonized too. But every time I look at especially young married couples who have babies, who have to get up at all hours of the day and night and watch over their children, who have become the center. They're definitely not self-centered. The parents aren't. They can't afford to be. They got to watch that child grow up.
Right.
Now, if that is not a holy reality, I don't know what is. Because when we can come out of ourselves and love another, then we are truly coming to know God. You know, in Les Mis, the opera, there's a song that, I forget who sings it, to love another person is to see the face of God. That is so beautiful and so true. So that's why I think parents should all be canonized. And we all know they love their children. Well, not all parents do, but all good parents love their children. It means they came out of themselves, so they see the face of God in their children. Yes. They never say it that way, I don't think, but that's the reality.
See, I think that's what happens with Angela. She calls the women who came to her my daughters.
Yes.
You know.
A relationship.
Yeah, that like a good parent, she came out of herself.
Yes.
And loved them.
Yes. It's amazing.
Yeah.
But you know, when you know you're loved, you're attracted to that.
Right.
And that's a sign of hope. How can I not hope if I know that I'm truly loved?
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martha.
The whole thing has come full circle now. I think we end kind of where we started with women. And so thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Insightful.
And